I'm logged into my Azure subscription now. If I navigate to virtual networks, this is the virtual network that I created yesterday. Production-network-A in East US. If I navigate to this network, and if I click on subnets and say under settings, by default, this is how it looks like. They intentionally hide all these settings, and then you need to expand that. So when you expand settings here, you see a couple of options here. These are configurations of this network. So the first configuration is address space. Since this was a default network, Azure picked up class A private IP address with maximum number of IPs, which is 65,536. That's the maximum number of IPs that you can pick in one network in Azure. You can create multiple networks in Azure. A network can have multiple subnets also. There is always a limit that you need to be aware of. If you ever want to know the limit of a specific service in Azure, you can always in Google type Azure services and subscription limits. Here you will get to this URL, which will talk about the limits, quotas, and constraints which are there in Azure. I'll put that into the chat window so you can open it on your system. So I have just shared it in the chat window. Now, tell me how many virtual networks I can create in a subscription. This document contains that information, limit for each service, whether it's Entra ID, whether it's network, whether it's storage account. It's a comprehensive documentation, which has been the same for the last couple of years. And Microsoft ensures changing it on regular basis as and when there are changes in the limits. All right. So, Monisha, how many virtual networks can I provision in Microsoft Azure subscription?
More than one, I guess.
Yeah, more than one. This is right. But how many? There is a number. There's a limit also. Those are known as soft limits or hard limits. So the best way to search for it, I would say if you keep searching it, it will take a lot of time because it's a lengthy documentation. What you can do Control App and you can type virtual network, right? And then you will see combinations here. So you see virtual network here. Here you will get to know the number of virtual networks. I'll tell you where you need to go to find this information. This is for Azure VMware solutions. This is virtual network rules. This is virtual network managed number of virtual networks. Okay, common limits for all tiers. But this is for Event Hub basically. So this is not what we are looking for. This is networking limit. This is the limit. This is where you can see. So we can have a maximum of 1,000 virtual networks created in an Azure subscription. In one subscription, I can have a maximum of 1,000 networks created. Now, 1,000 is a huge number. No customer would ever reach to this number. Why? Because each network is separate. If you end up creating multiple networks, you will also need to manage security, connectivity, and administration of those networks. And no customer would want to increase the administration overhead. So they would always have limited number of networks. Why Azure is keeping a limit so that it can satisfy the largest customer in the world, the maximum possible deployments that are possible. That is why Azure is keeping a limit here. So 1,000 is the limit of virtual networks per subscription. Similarly, if you want to see the limits of how many subnets I can create in a virtual network, it's 3,000, which is way too much. I have not seen a customer having more than 100 subnets per virtual network, and 100 is the largest number that I'm telling you that that happens when the customer is quite old in Microsoft Azure, probably 10 years old. Otherwise, we typically have very limited subnets like web subnet, app subnet, DB subnet, management subnet, and some application specific subnet. That's what we have. Similarly, you can see virtual network peering for virtual network is 500. So you see all the limits. If you want to see that what is my total private IP address limit for a virtual network, it is here. Private IP addresses per virtual network. It's 65,536. And that's exactly what is happening here. If you see, Azure has picked up a virtual network address space with the maximum limits for you. So you cannot create a virtual network with /1514. It has to be /16 and above because it has to align with the limits. So these are all the limits. If you want to see how many public IPs I can get per virtual network, or you can see all the limits related to public IPs also here. Public IP address per network interface is 256. Public IP address per virtual machine is 256. You see all the limits here. This is common limits for virtual network, networking limits. Similarly, if you ever want to see any limit, let's say you want to find out the limits for Entra ID. Now, Entra ID is another service that we will be dealing with in this training, and you want to find out the limits of Entra ID. So you can type Entra here, and it will show you Entra ID limits. These are the Entra ID limits. So, for example, if you want to understand the limits at the tenant level, a single user can belong to a maximum of 500 Entra tenants as a member or a guest. This is one limit, which means if you are supporting multiple customers and if customers are either creating a member account for you or a guest account for you, you cannot be present in more than 500 tenants at any point in time. So it basically means that you will not be able to support more than 500 customers. And you also understand that 500 is way a too large number. In a production environment, we typically support not more than 5-10 customers. Even if you are into project management, you would not have more than 10, 15, or I would say 20 customers that you manage. I'm already taking a very large limit. Typically in production or center of excellence or in operations, you you don't support more than 10 customers because you also need to provide support efficiently, meet customer expectations, ensure customer happiness and other factors, other success factors that has been devised by the management. So that's the limit. You can create a maximum of 200 tenants. So if you if you are Entra ID admin for your organization with global administrator access, a maximum of 200 tenants you can create in your Entra ID. There is a limit of 300 license-based subscriptions, such as Microsoft 365 subscription per tenant. So, which basically means that inside a tenant, you can have a maximum of 200 tenants, and each tenant would not have more than 300 subscriptions in it. So there is a limit of subscriptions also inside an Entra ID channel. Now, you probably were not aware of these limits until today because you have not come across a scenario wherein a customer has gone to that extent. However, as a consultant or an architect, you must be aware of the limits of a service because your customer may inquire about it. Or while creating a solution, while looking at the size, scale, and complexity of your customer for whom you are designing the solution, you should be aware of the limits so that you don't end up provisioning a solution that will come across a roadblock in the form of limits in the long run. And customer will accuse that who designed the solution, who was the architect, why that person did not accommodate or you know uh, or kind of took a cushion for it. So that is why limits are very important that you need to understand. So if you're more interested in Entra, these are the limits related to Entra. All the capabilities of Entra, you can see the limits, how many administrative units, how many application proxies, how many Entra permissions and roles. You can see all the limits here. conditional access, a maximum of 195 conditional access policies can be created in a single Entra organization. So some of you deal with conditional access policies. However, if you go back to your account, whichever you support, go ahead and count the number of policies. You will not find more than 20, 30, 50. That is why you are not aware that the limit is 195. So you will not be able to create more than 195 conditional access policies in a single Entra organization or tenant. And you cannot add more than 40 terms to a single tenant. So these are all the limits related to Entra ID. So please make sure that you always have this URL handy when you are working with Microsoft Azure. Any service of Microsoft Azure that you are working with, if you ever come across a question wherein somebody asks you a limit or the maximum possible combinations, go, quickly come to this article, look for the number and tell it to the person. If there is a conflicting situation, share the article URL and tell them that you have not built the service at home. You are a practitioner of this service and the service belongs to Microsoft and you're sharing Microsoft article. If the other person still is not convinced, you can further tell them that you will connect with Microsoft to seek clarification and share the official response. That's how you need to manage the conflicting situations if it ever arises. And it happens a lot of time when you are working as a consultant or an architect, and your job is to design and architect identity and access management solution using Entra ID to your customers. Probably you're not doing that today because some of you have recently entered into this Entra space. You will be doing that probably a year from now, 2 years from now. So let's get ready for that situation. Let's, you know, it must reflect in your communication so that your management gets the confidence that this person who was recently onboarded into this team knows what he or she does, what he or she talks about, and this person can be given opportunities. So you need to create opportunities for yourself. Don't wait for your management to think about yourself and give you an opportunity. When I had been into a full-time employment, I would always look for opportunities. I would always look for challenges, problem statements in my team, situations that nobody was addressing, situations that nobody was bothered to address about, situations which pained a lot, but nobody had a solution. I would invest an hour or two every day thinking about the solution of those situations. And when I have the solution, I would approach my management and say, I've got the solution. And that basically, kind of, made my presence felt in the team. And I was able to get, I was able to move quickly in my career ladder. And by the time I retired at the age of 35, I was already working as a director with one of the big four. And that was the last position in that big four or across big four. You either become a partner or a director. So this was just my personal personal approach that I basically took when I used to work as a full-time employee. I never waited for my management to give me an opportunity. I always grabbed opportunity. If it was not there, I created the one. And I never felt shy of sharing my knowledge and experience with others, because sometimes you don't share with people, thinking that if I tell everything to this person, what would I do then? I would be obsolete. My management would say that now what Monisha does, other people are also doing. So we don't need Monisha. Never ever think in that manner. Think what you can do new. Whatever you know, hand it over to your juniors and then think what else you can do, what new you can do, what value proposition you can bring on the table for your project, for your management, for your employer. Change the mindset. If you work with this mindset, you will see yourself growing. I know what happens in TCS, what happens in large corporates like TCS, HCL, Infosys, where there are hundreds of thousands of employees. You continue to work at the same position for a couple of years. Why? Because of your approach. You don't lose yourself. Lose yourself Share whatever you know with your team members, with your juniors, and think of what else you can do. Something that they are not doing, they cannot do. They have not thought about doing at all. All right, so enough of Gyan. Let's come back to subscription and service limits. So this was another thing that really helped me in my consulting and architecting career, wherein there had been a lot of conflicting situations, and this document really helped me to sail through by showing it to the customer and telling that the design that we are creating today will is good to go for next 6 months or probably 6 years down the line. However, after 6 years, this design may need some rehaul because of those limits. Or Microsoft will increase the limits. We hope so. That's how we did the design, whether it was Entra ID, whether it was networking, whether it was any service. Great. So this is the document. Always keep handy. Let's come back to the Word document. All right. So we wanted to create a subscription with multiple subnets. And now that we know that the maximum subnets that I can create in a virtual network is 3000. That's the maximum limit of subnets. However, I don't need 3000 subnets. In my organization, and see, one thing that you need to do, guys, which I almost forgot to ask you on day one. When you learn something in this session, go back to your project, log into your project subscription, whichever you have access to, and compare and correlate and see what do you have there in terms of that service. So if I'm telling you today that there could be a maximum of 3000 subnets in a virtual network, there could be a maximum of, let's say, 1000 virtual networks in a subscription, there could be a maximum of 195 tenants in Entra ID. Log in to your account, to your project account, and see what is the current number that you are maintaining there. Are you almost reaching the limit or you are well below the limit? That is how you can compare and correlate, and this will help you retain this knowledge for a long time. Make sense, guys?
Yes, Raghuveer.
Great. So this is my network. So this is my network. It's a default network. Why? Because it says subnet name is default. However, I can add more subnets here. I can add more subnetworks if I wish. I will not add more subnetworks in this network because it's a default network. I will create my own custom network and then I will create subnets. I shared with you the recorded session video URL that contains the instruction of how do we build virtual networks and subnets in Azure. I'm giving you a demo now when I will be creating a virtual network, a custom virtual network with all the customizations. And I would expect you to follow me, do it along with me if you've not already done yesterday, so that you will also understand the concept. The other thing, you must have received an email from Farhan yesterday in the evening with, with link of session recordings. It's it's a proctored link, which basically means uh, I would always get logs how many times you're accessing the session recording, for how long you are for how many hours you're accessing it, and every time you log in, every time you access the session recording, I would know because it's password protected. So please make sure that you access the session recordings after the session is over if you missed something or if you want to recap something. So are all of you able to access the session recording till yesterday? I will say the session recording for Monday and Tuesday. Did you check that part?
Yes, 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 we received.
Yeah.
But whether are you able to access or not? That's the question. Can you check quickly,
Uh,
guys? Because
Sorry, I have not
I have not
received
received it.
anything. Yeah.
you've not received it. How come that is possible? Let me just double. So as I said, I will go ahead and provision a virtual network with all the configurations once again, so that we can do a quick recap here. And then I would expect you to practice it. Uh, I will give you time to practice so that you can practice it yourself. So let's go ahead and provision the virtual network in Microsoft Azure portal. So we'll navigate to Virtual Network Blade. In the Virtual Network Blade, we will see all the existing virtual networks. Those have been created in the past, and then we will hit create. When you hit create, it opens virtual network creation blade, a form that you need to fill with the required information. So the first thing that it will ask you is subscription name. Subscription name is already selected. If you have multiple subscriptions, then you would need to select it from the drop down. Since you only have access to one subscription, it's by default selected. Then it would ask you for a resource group, which is nothing but a resource container that will hold this virtual network resource and other resources that you will create in future as part of this training session. So we can either choose an existing resource group or we can create a new resource group also. Since we have an existing resource group, I'll choose that resource group. Then I need to provide virtual network name. In a production environment, when you provide name to a resource, you typically follow nomenclature, a nomenclature that has been defined by your management, a nomenclature that typically gives you some idea about what that resource is, who does it belong to, all that information. So Microsoft has a documentation that helps you create nomenclature for resources. Since this is a training environment, we can just use any name that comes to our mind. So I would say this is my training VNet 1. Then you need to select region where you are building the network. I will be selecting South India, which is Chennai. Next, it will ask you a couple of security configurations that you may want to enable. These are optional. Virtual network encryption will ensure encrypting traffic that travels within the virtual network. Businesses who are into financial as well as manufacturing industry vertical, they typically go for this configuration because they are regulated business, highly regulated business, and they don't want to take a risk of any security risk. However, since this has been recently introduced, I have not seen customers using this feature because encryption and decryption, when it happens for each traffic, it also affects performance. It increases latency. Bastion Host is a service that provides secure RDP and SSH connectivity to virtual machines with private IP addresses. Those are not accessible over the internet or from the internet. So you can create a Bastion Host service. Definitely it costs you, it's a paid service, but this will allow secure connectivity to your virtual machines in the event of when you don't have a VPN connection. If you have a VPN connection, you can directly connect to those virtual machines over private IP because your VPN tunnel will enable that facility. If you don't have a VPN connection, you can create Bastion Host service. It's a fully managed service. It's a PaaS service by Microsoft that allows you secure connectivity to your virtual machine resources, which is RDP and SSH, and it's a browser-based service. So you have a browser-based connectivity. Then comes Azure Firewall. Once again, it's a fully managed security service from Microsoft Azure, which is similar to a next-gen firewall. Definitely does not have all the capabilities that a next-gen firewall can bring on the table, but it's a good bet when you don't have existing investments into a next-gen firewall. DDoS protection stands for distributed denial of service protection. Denial of service is an attack that basically makes a resource over the internet inaccessible, unavailable by sending multiple illegitimate requests to it and unnecessarily bombarding the request and make that resource unavailable. Every resource over the internet has a limit in terms of how many concurrent user sessions it can handle, how many user requests it can handle, TCP/IP request it can handle. So in DOS attack, they basically reach to that limit and legitimate users are not able to access it. DDoS is an advanced version of it, wherein they use bots which are spread across network in the world, and there is a botnet, a manager, or kind of an administrator or a master who basically instruct those bots to access a specific website or portal from across the world so that the advanced security solutions are not able to identify that attack and and the attacker is able to meet the objectives. So Azure provides you DDoS network protection service. It is an advanced service. The basic DDoS protection is enabled by default in all the Azure networks. If you want to get the advanced protection, then you can enable this service. The cost of this service is approximately $3,000 per month, which is roughly $100 per day. So don't enable this service. Don't enable any of these services unless you explicitly need it, unless you have thousands of dollars of credit in your account. So we will not enable any of these service. We'll proceed further. On the next step, we need to provide IP address space for our network. A network without an IP address space is incomplete. By default, Azure picks up Class A private IP address range with maximum possible IP addresses, as you have just seen in the subscription and service limits documentation. Since this is my custom network and I primarily use Class A private IP address range in my on-premises network, and I don't want any conflicting situation, any IP address overlapping, any redundant IP addresses. So instead of using Class A, most of the customers that I have seen in production, they use Class C address space. So I will delete this address space and I will add another address space, which is 192.168.1.0/24. You don't need to type /24 here. That CIDR block you can select from the drop down. So the moment you select a CIDR block, it will tell you the maximum number of IPs in that block. So when I select this address space, I will have a maximum of 256 IP addresses. My first IP will be 1.0, last IP will be 1.255. Definitely, I cannot use 0. I cannot use 255. I can also not use 1.1, 1.2, and 1.3 because in Azure, with each network and with each subnet, first 4 IPs and last IP is reserved for internal purposes. If you want to know what exactly Microsoft Azure does with those first 4 and last IP, we will click on Add Subnet here, and we can create as many subnets as we want. When I say as many, it cannot go beyond 3000, which is the maximum limit. So subnet purpose will remain default. Name of the subnet you can choose here. I'll say I want to create a subnet in which I will host all my web services. So name of the subnet is web subnet. I would need IP address v4 space, which is OK. It has already picked up the subnet address space, which is IP address space of the network. And then it is asking you to define that how many IPs do you need in this subnet. So based on the size that I pick and choose, the number of IPs will be decided. Right now, it has already picked up /24, which means with this subnet, the entire range will be exhausted. So instead of 24, I will select 27, which is 32 IPs. And you can see my first IP will be 1.0, last IP will be 1.31 for this subnet. Rest of the fields I will leave it as it is and click on add. So that is how I add a subnet. Now I can add multiple subnets here in this view itself, or I can add additional subnets after this virtual network is created. Both options are available. So I will add one more subnet, which is my application subnet. Now, when you add additional subnet, all you need to do, just define this information, starting address and size, and obviously the name of the subnet. So when you click on the starting address, you can see it has picked up 192.168.1.128. Now, in your previous segment, the previous subnet that you have taken, web subnet, the last IP address was 31. So Azure is randomly picking it. And I don't want random configuration in my environment. I want it consistent. So instead of 128, I'll pick 32, which is my next IP. So starting IP is 32, and then I will keep consistency, which is /27. So once again, I will have 27, a total of 32 IPs in app subnet. My starting IP would be 32. My last IP would be 63, and I will add it. So this is how you can keep on adding additional subnets up to a limit of 3000. Also, a limit of maximum number of IP addresses. If the maximum number of IP addresses limit is reached, obviously you will not be able to add additional subnets. For that, you will need to add an additional range of IP address that you can do after this network is created. So that is all that you do on IP address space. Let's move on. Next is tags. Tags really help you to categorize or recognize resources that belongs to you, that belongs to a business unit, that belongs to a department. And they also help you in billing and chargeback, in putting in place security controls also. So typically we will go with two tags, which is purpose. Purpose is purpose of this resource is, let's say, Azure training, and then owner, who is the owner of this resource. So I will put my name here. If you have used tags before in a subscription, you will see them in the drop down also. So you can directly pick them from the drop down. You don't need to type it again and again. That's it. The last tab is review plus create. Whatever information you have provided so far. Now you will hit review plus create. Azure will validate that information, whether it aligns with Azure mandates, Azure best practices, Azure, Azure portal, Azure portal configurations, and accordingly, it will either result in a failure or it will be successful. If it is successful, then you will get a create button highlighted. If it fails, then it will also highlight the tab where it is failing so that you can navigate to that tab and you can fix the configuration. So I'll hit review plus create. It's running the validation. It has been successful. I get create button. I will hit create and I will see a notification in the bell icon here, which says that yes, it has accepted it. It is submitting the deployment and it is creating the resource based on the configuration that I have provided. This will take a couple of seconds to get completed, depending on what you are building. So now that our virtual network is built, we'll navigate to this virtual network. So this is the virtual network that we have just built. If we navigate to address space, we can see its address space and total number of IPs that we have. It will not tell you here whether this address space is already exhausted, whether you have IP addresses still available that you need to find yourself based on the subnets. So right now it only shows you the address space. Let's assume that your existing address space is exhausted. All IPs from this address space have been allocated to subnets. And you want more IPs because you have more devices, more applications to be hosted in Azure, and they need an IP address. So what we can do here, we can add an address space, additional address space here. So let's say I will add an additional address space, which is 192.168, and I can always change the third octet to get more IPs. Instead of 1.0, I will now put 2.0/24. And you will see the moment I put 2.0/24, it is first of all showing me a green check, which basically means that this has been accepted by Azure. This is in right term, and I have another 256 IP addresses available. I can save it. Now I have a total of 512 IP addresses available in this network. In future, if you ever run short of IP addresses, come back to this window and add additional address spaces. For how long you can go? 1.2.3.4 till 220.255. The last address space that you can add is 192.168.255.0/24. That will be the last address space that you can add. So imagine how many IP addresses you can have. Multiply 256 by 255 and you will reach the number. So there is no shortage of IP addresses in Azure. You can start small and expand as and when needed. That's the thumb rule of networking also. Don't purchase a 16 BHK flat for your family of 4 members. You can start with 2 BHK. As and when your family grows, you can probably switch, you can probably migrate to another bigger house, or you can manage things accordingly. But there is no point of purchasing a 16 BHK, a penthouse for a family members of 4, because it unnecessarily increases the administration overhead. You will need to manage those additional rooms that you are not using. Same concept with networking. Don't create a larger network with millions of IP addresses that you don't need. It will unnecessarily hurt you back in the long run with security incidents, with misconfigurations, with administrative overhead. Let's move on. Next is subnet. So we only built 2 subnets. Now, if we need more subnets, we have some additional workloads that we want to host in Azure, and we don't want to host them in the existing subnets or with existing services because their requirement is different. Their connectivity security requirements are different. So we can add additional subnets by clicking on subnet plus here, and then you will see the same view. Let's add a DB subnet now. Once again, you provide the name of the subnet. Look at the starting address. Azure always picks up random numbers. So I will always do consistent. So I know that with app subnet, I was able to take 63 IPs. So I will start with 64 here and I will go with /27. Why I'm keeping it consistent /27? So that all the subnets have same number of IPs. If you feel that no, I would have more web servers as compared to DB, you can always take other CIDR blocks. You can take a smaller CIDR block, like let's say /26, that will give you 64 IPs. You can even take /25, that will give you 128 IPs. You just need to follow the networking thumb rules or basic principles, and you can manage things accordingly. The more you practice, the more you learn that where you actually hit the roadblock, what is not possible, what is possible. So I click on add, and this will add another subnet to my network. This is how I can keep adding subnets. You can see so far I have used 96 IP addresses because with this DB subnet, my last IP is 95. You can see here with the DB subnet, my last IP will be 95. So I have used a total of 95 IP addresses. There are a total of 256. So I'm still left with a lot many IP addresses. Now, if you remember, I have added an additional address space in the network also. If I want to get IP addresses from that address space, I can also take it. So let's say I'll add another subnet with the name, let's say management subnet. And for this subnet, I will take the other IP address range that I have created. So instead of 1.0, I can take 2.0 or 255.01 also, any of them. So I'll pick up 2.0. Now the subnet IP address space will be factored from this address space. So now I can do /27 once again, and this will add another subnet, management subnet, which will get IP addresses from the additional address space that I added to my network. So you can see it says 2.0. So this is how I manage my network. Now, when it comes to a service in Microsoft Azure, there are multiple configuration options. Since our focus is not becoming an Azure administrator, I will not get into the depth of those services. However, you have access to this Azure subscription. If you have interest, you can explore those additional services yourself and come back with questions or any input that you need from my end. I'll be more than happy to work with you and help you understand that concept. So you can see there are some additional concepts like firewall, defender for cloud, DNS, peering, private endpoints, service endpoints. Under monitoring, you see monitoring capabilities that we will talk about definitely, but monitoring in general when we reach to that point. So these are my options when I provision a virtual network. Virtual network also provides you DNS services. If you click on DNS server, you will see that right now the DNS services are provided by Azure. It says Azure provided default. However, if you have a DNS server in your environment, a DNS server that is part of your Active Directory domain, a DNS server that has been separately created. You want to manage your records. You don't want Azure to manage your DNS records, or you don't want a third party to manage. Then you can add your DNS server also. All you need to do, just hit custom and type your DNS server IP address. If that DNS server is configured on premises, you will type private IP. If it is configured in Azure, you will type private IP. So if it is in Azure, you type private IP, it will automatically search it. It has to be in the same network. If it is configured in on-premises, even though you can provide the private IP, the condition is this network must be connected to your on-premises network where the DNS server lies. So that whenever a device in this network searches, makes a DNS query or tries to browse a resource over the internet, this DNS server that you are adding here will take care of the resolution, will basically provide the DNS resolution. That's the DNS concept. It's a normal networking concept that is applicable here. So in a production environment, they would never go with Azure provided DNS. They would go with their own DNS. Give me a moment. All right, so that's the DNS concept that you need to be aware of. And DNS is very important service for any organization. In fact, your Entra ID has a huge dependency on DNS because when you configure single sign-on, when you configure some of the capabilities of Entra ID, they depend on DNS resolution. So most of the organizations for their production environment, they use their own custom DNS server. It could be a third-party DNS service, or it could be their own DNS server, that DNS role that they create as part of Windows Server Active Directory, integrated DNS, or a separate role which is available in Windows Server. So that's the concept of DNS that you need to be aware of. So this is how we provision a network, a custom network with our own address space and own network address space and subnet configuration along with DNS in a production environment. I'm open to questions if you have any before I ask you to go ahead and provision this virtual network yourself. Basically provision two virtual networks so that we can discuss the next topic, the next lab, which is connect two virtual networks to share resources and communication. So we are done with the second lab also.
Hi, Raghu.
Yes.
I had gone through that video that was shared yesterday
Uh-huh.
for this virtual network, and um, uh, I had there was this gateway that you can configure, right, in the as part of the subnets.
This way.
Yeah, that one.
So you want
So
to
that was,
understand what is gateway subnet?
yeah, because it was there as part of that creation of subnets in your.
Yeah,
Uh,
I'll tell you what gateway subnet is. So when you want this virtual network to communicate with other networks, in on-premises offices or in other clouds or in other Azure tenants, then you need a gateway. Gateway is a service which helps you create a VPN tunnel from this network to other network. And that gateway service, virtual network gateway service, requires a dedicated subnet. You cannot host that gateway service in an existing subnet. So for example, I cannot put gateway service in web subnet, app subnet, DB subnet, management subnet, because it requires a dedicated subnet of its own. So whenever I'm ready to create a VPN tunnel or connectivity of this network to other networks, what I will do, I will hit gateway subnet and I'll create a gateway subnet here. Now Microsoft has some best practices for gateway subnet. A, you cannot choose the gateway subnet name. It will always be like this. That's the reason you don't see an option to change it. Second, the gateway subnet address space should be a minimum of 26 or 25. Why Microsoft asks you to take this address space? So that when you have multiple concurrent sessions in your VPN tunnel, the gateway is able to take care of those sessions or take care of that load. That is why gateway needs a minimum of /27. /27 is what Microsoft suggests. But if you feel that your network will have a lot of bandwidth, lot of traffic, flowing, from source to destination and vice versa, you can always go with /26 or 25. And if you look carefully, when we hit add gateway subnet, Microsoft by default was picking up /25. It was picking up maximum number of addresses. Now we cannot use this address. I'm saying we cannot use /25 here. If I want to give 128 IP addresses to my gateway, then I will need to take another address space which is not touched yet, which is 255 one. Here I can get 126, 28 IPs. But for a production environment where there are thousands of users communicating on VPN tunnel at the same time, I have not seen customers going beyond /26. So they always go with /26, which is 64 IPs, more than sufficient. That's what they typically do. So that's the concept of gateway subnet, which is needed for setting up for provisioning virtual network gateway device, which is used for configuring VPN tunnel or connectivity IPsec VPN tunnel from this network to other networks. Hope that makes sense.
Yeah, and also there was a mention of that for the Microsoft best practice, the
Hmm.
last range of IP addresses is to be used.
To be used for the gateway.
So yeah, so
Yeah.
when you see here, when you were trying to configure it and you changed the available IPs, it was not picking up the last few IP addresses, right? Because it was picking up from
It
where
will
it
not
was
pick
left
up.
in the subnet.
No, it will not pick up. You need to manually give it because
No, we
Microsoft,
have an option there because I did not
for
see
example,
anything of that.
For example, if I want to provision this gateway, let's say this is a production environment and I want to provision gateway, and I know that I have got three subnet ranges as three address spaces. This is my last address space. So I would always provision gateway from here, right? From this address space.
Okay.
And then in this address space also, if I want to give, let's say 32 IP addresses to gateway /27, which is the recommendation, then I will not use that /27 starting from 0. No, I will
Mm.
not do that. I will probably start from 224, right? So
Okay.
224 is the last range because if you add 32 in 224, it comes out 256. So this is the range that I will pick for my gateway. The reason I'm choosing the last range because my VPN device should either sit at the beginning or at the end of the network. It should not be in the
Okay.
middle of the network. Now, my VPN cannot be at the beginning because VPN I planned later on. After I created my network, then I planned for connectivity. That is why my gateway should always go into the end so that it has a clear information of all other IPs in the network. That's the logic.
Okay.
This is
Yeah.
also one of
Thank
the best practice for creating a gateway subnet.
you. Okay. Thank you.
Any other question, guys? All right. If there are no more questions, I would ask everyone to create two networks with separate address space so that I can show you the connectivity method also, that how do we connect two networks in Azure without configuring a VPN tunnel or without the need of a gateway, and how do we allow those two networks to communicate with each other. When I say networks are communicating, it basically means the resources inside the network are able to share data and information. They're able to communicate with one another. That's what network communication is all about. So go ahead and provision two virtual networks. I'll give you 5 minutes to complete this, and then we'll talk about the peering part. I already have two virtual networks now that I will be using to show you the third lab, which is connect two virtual networks to share resources and enable communication. The connectivity part now. All right. So let's say these are two virtual networks that you want to connect. Now, when it comes to connecting two virtual networks, you need to keep some best practices in mind or some limitations in mind. For example, we have a total of 4 virtual networks here. And if you look carefully, they are across regions. One virtual network on the top is in East US. The other two virtual networks are in South India. And the fourth virtual network is in Canada Central. Right? So there are 3 geographies that I'm talking about here: US, Canada, and India. However, all of these virtual networks have one common relationship, and that is that all of them are part of the same subscription, Azure Pass sponsorship. So virtual networks, irrespective of their region, if they are part of the same subscription, you can connect them without any restriction. There is no restriction. You can connect those virtual networks. Now imagine a situation wherein this is a production account of a company which has multiple subscriptions. It has multiple subscriptions, and virtual network across subscriptions wants to communicate. So understand this connectivity part. Give me just 1 minute. Okay, so these are some of the things that you need to know for virtual network peering. First, virtual networks across region can connect or can peer if they are part of the same subscription. That's one thing that you need to remember. Second, virtual network across regions, subscriptions can connect or peer. Peer is the word that we use, basically peering, if they are part of the same Entra ID tenant. That's the two things that you need to remember as a limitation of virtual network peering. Now, if virtual networks are across Entra ID tenant, then you cannot peer them because tenants, Entra ID tenants are isolated. And that is why you have workforce identities, permission management features, or guest, guest account feature, guest identity feature, so that you can have identities from different tenant granting access to your tenant so that they can access applications and workloads in your tenant. So Entra ID tenants are isolated by default. And that is why if there are virtual networks which exist across Entra ID tenants, you cannot peer them. Now the question is, we cannot peer them, but we still have a legitimate need to connect them. Take an example. TCS acquires a company which is also using Microsoft Azure. And they have a couple of workloads and applications hosted in Microsoft Azure. They have their own tenant. Now that TCS has acquired it, TCS wants their applications, their employees to access those applications of the acquired company. However, in this case, TCS Entra ID tenant is different. That company's Entra ID tenant is different. So there is absolutely no communication, no visibility, no clear line of sight. In that case, virtual network that is part of TCS and virtual network that is part of, let's say, ABC Corp, they are across tenants. So this tenant is different, this tenant is different. You cannot do peering. Peering is not possible. However, if you still want to connect these two virtual networks so that applications in TCS network can communicate or collaborate with this virtual network and vice versa with this tenant and vice versa. For that, you will do virtual network to virtual network connectivity via VPN or virtual network gateway service. And this virtual network gateway service is what that we deploy in that dedicated gateway subnet. So you will actually create two gateways. You will create one gateway in TCS virtual network. You will create other gateway in ABC Corp virtual network. And those two gateways will be configured to communicate with each other. And once that communication is configured, then this virtual network in TCS or applications and workload in TCS virtual network can communicate with the other virtual network. That's the concept here. So this type of connectivity is enabled through virtual network gateways, and this type of connectivity is known as VNet to VNet connectivity. Now, there is another difference between peering and VNet to VNet connectivity. When I say peering of these two use cases, these two use cases basically means peering. In peered network, the traffic from source to destination is not encrypted. That's the difference. In peered networks, traffic from source to destination and vice versa is not encrypted. However, in VNet to VNet connectivity, traffic is encrypted. Why traffic is encrypted? Because this virtual network gateway is similar to a VPN service, VPN device, whose job is to create a secure communication through a three-way handshake and then use encryption. So it uses encryption. That is why traffic is encrypted in VNet to VNet connectivity. In VNet peering, traffic is not encrypted. Now you know the reason why traffic is not encrypted, because see, the Entra ID tenant is same. When the tenant is same, then definitely they are part of the same group, same company, same environment. So why to unnecessarily encrypt the traffic and then decrypt it and unnecessarily affect the performance and increase the latency? You can trust each other because you both are wearing, I'm saying two TCS employees when they meet in cafeteria, when they have not seen each other in the past ever. But one thing is common, which is they both are wearing a badge which says TCS, which says their employee ID, probably blood group. So they know that, okay, we both have one relationship in common, that our employer is TCS. So they can communicate. That's why encryption is not needed in peered virtual networks. However, in VNet to VNet connectivity, you don't know the other person, whether that person is from TCS or some other company, and you happen to meet that person in cafeteria. Now, before you share any information, you would like to make sure that the information is not leaked. That is where encryption is needed. So you will mutually create a trust in the form of encryption. That's the concept. Now, the point is, what if I want encryption to be there? I want peering in banking scenario, in banking industry. Banks typically don't go with peering. They always go with VNet to VNet connectivity. Even though the virtual networks are in the same subscription, instead of peering them, they would always go with VNet to VNet connectivity, so that when traffic leaves from source to destination, it is encrypted. When it reaches the destination, it is decrypted. That's what bank and manufacturing industries does. They are highly regulated industries. But these are the two options that you need to be aware of. Is everyone with me on this? Yes, no, maybe?
Yes.
Yes,
Okay.
Ravi.
Then comes the cost part. Now, in peering, there's a cost here. See, in VNet to VNet connectivity, there's a cost for sure because they are two different networks across different tenants. So definitely there will be a cost. But in case of peering also, when both the network belong to the same subscription, same region, same tenant, there is a cost. And there is an egress cost. As I told you, anything that goes out is chargeable. Anything that comes in is free. So in VNet peering, there is an egress cost, which is typically, I'm saying, which is typically 0.01 USD per GB of traffic. Per GB of outbound traffic, this is the cost, which you can say $1 per 100 GB of traffic. So 100 GB of traffic or data that you transfer from source to destination, you will be charged almost $1. Now, this is very substantial. You would say 100 GB is too much of data and $1 is very less. It's substantial. Absolutely, it is substantial. But think of an environment where there is terabytes of data transfer that happening every day. Then this becomes significant. This number becomes significant, if not on monthly basis, then probably on yearly basis. So when it comes to FinOps or cost optimization, professionals who are in cost optimization team, whose job is to optimize the cost, reduce the billing a month on month basis, year on year basis, or keep it optimized, they basically look into these costs and see where exactly we can reduce the cost. They look at the bill and they see the red flags where exactly the cost is coming from, and they start to focus on those costs, those services, and they start to think of avenues to reduce that cost. So that's on the peering part. Let's go ahead and do the peering. So peering is very simple in Azure. In fact, in AWS and GCP also, you just need to know which two virtual networks you are peering. So let's say I'm peering production network A with Raghuveer VNet 1. These are the two networks that I want to peer. So I will navigate to any of these two networks. I can go to the first one or second one. The process remains the same. Let's say I go to one network, which is Raghuveer VNet 1. Inside that network, under settings, there is an option with the name peering. Click on that option and then click on add. When you add, over here, you provide both the network information. You provide both the network information in the same window. So let's say I want to pair this network, Raghuveer VNet 1, with the other network. So first, I will provide the peering link name, remote virtual network summary. Here, I will provide the remote network information. And in the same and in the next window, I will provide the local network information. That's the so in the same window, I will provide information of both the networks. So I will provide the name. This is remote virtual network summary, the other network with which I'm doing the peering. So I can just say demo peering. Then I will need to select that remote network. So it says I know my resource ID. I can either put the resource ID of that network, resource ID concept I explained yesterday, that why resource ID is important, or I can manually select it. So I know that network is part of this subscription. I can select that network from here, which is production network A. So I've selected the network. Now, the moment I selected the network, notice that it says that the address space is overlapping now. So if the address space are overlapping, peering will not be possible. Any connectivity will not be possible. So since address space is overlapping, I will probably choose another network just for the demo perspective. So I've chosen another network, VNet 1 Entra ID for the peering. Then I will provide some information, which is now that two networks are paired, how do I want to forward the traffic? So it says allow this network to access this network. Yes, because that's why we are doing the peering, so that the remote network can access the local network. And then it says allow the remote network to receive forwarded traffic from local network. Yes, allow gateway or route server in the remote network to forward traffic to this. So you can select these settings basically. First two settings we select by default so that all the communication can work. The last two settings depends from project to project. This setting basically means that when you have multiple networks, instead of creating gateways in each network, you can probably create a peering and use gateway of the other network, because gateway is a paid service. There's a cost associated with it. Then I'll provide the local network information. Local network, the one that I'm in right now, which is Raghuveer VNet 1. So I will need to provide the name for the local network also. So I will say POC demo peering. And then the same questions. So I will just check two questions. Now, when you do peering, you can also do one-sided peering, which is one network can communicate to other, but the other cannot communicate to the first one. So if I do not check this box, only the traffic from this network, remote network, which is VNet Entra ID, which is my remote network, will come to my local network, which is Raghuveer VNet 1. If I don't check this box, then it will be one-sided peering. So if you want to have bidirectional traffic allowed, you will check the second box. Now the bidirectional traffic will be allowed. That's it. After you select these options, just hit add, and you can see it is creating two peering connections. One from remote network to local network, and the other from local network to remote network. So earlier, uh, probably 2-3 years ago, when we would do peering, we would need to configure this in both the networks. First, you will go to first network, do the configuration. Then you navigate to the second network and do the configuration. But now you don't need to go to both the networks to do the configuration. You can just do the configuration in one of the networks and it is automatically enabled for the other one. So you can see here, I have done peering configuration for Raghuveer VNet 1. If I go to peering, I would say name of the peering connection and it says fully synchronized connected. So it's a green check, which means peering is done. And it also shows you with which I'm peering. So it shows you my other network also with which the peering is done, which is VNet hyphen 1 hyphen Entra ID, right? And if I go to that other network, then I will also see the same information. In the other network, if I go to peering, you will see the same information here also, wherein it shows you that yes, this network is paired and this network is paired with Raghuveer VNet 1. So this is about peering. Now that these two networks are paired, if you want to test whether they can communicate, you will need to deploy one virtual machine in each network, and then you will need to, just do a ping, or you can, copy or transfer some data, and you can see it will work. This is something that we can probably do when we reach to the compute topic, when we will provision virtual machines. But when it comes to peering, this is how we do the peering. So this is about peering. I'm open to questions if you have any on the peering part. Any questions, guys, on peering?
No.
Okay. If there are no more questions, let's see if there is anything else that we want to connect in this virtual network part. So we did benefits of Azure Virtual Network, use cases, planning, subnet we covered, public and private IP address we covered, network security group and system routes. Let's understand the network security group concept also. Okay, so let's understand the network security group also. Now, network security group is a virtual firewall, or it's a low capability firewall service or security service whose job is to filter the traffic based on port and protocol, which basically means look at the image. In this image, we are showing NSG. Let's say there are 4 virtual machines in this image. Now, by default, since all of these 4 virtual machines are part of the same network, you can see they are in the same network. The box, the red box that I'm drawing, this is the virtual network. And inside that virtual network, you have 3 subnets. Subnet 1, Subnet 2, and Subnet 3. Now, by default, all these virtual machines, all the 4 virtual machines can talk to each other without any restriction. That's how a network is designed. By default, inside a network, resources can communicate with one another without any restriction. However, in a production environment, you would want to put certain restrictions. You want to allow specific traffic only from one machine to another based on the role that the machine is hosting. For example, let's imagine that the first 2 are my web servers. The middle one is my app server. And the last one is my DB server. As we discussed yesterday, we typically don't allow any traffic from web to DB. We don't allow this traffic in a production environment. This traffic is not allowed. We always allow traffic from web to app and app to DB. But by default, in the network, all traffic is allowed. So I want to create a custom rule to restrict traffic from web to DB. That is where NSG comes into the picture. So I will create a network security group rule that will allow all outbound traffic from web subnet to DB subnet. Or I can create a NSG rule that will deny all inbound traffic from web subnet to DB subnet, whichever way I want to do it, because NSG has both inbound and outbound rule. So if I want to create an outbound rule, I will create it from web subnet and I'll say any traffic which is destined towards DB subnet, please deny it. Or I can create an inbound rule at the DB subnet and say any inbound traffic from web subnet, please deny. So that these 2 subnets cannot talk. That's the concept of NSG with the help of inbound and outbound security rules. If you want to understand that in detail, I have a separate session on NSG that you will find in my playlist, and our session wherein I am talking about NSGs in detail with every minute use cases that supports. But in this training, since we don't need to deep dive into networking, but we need to have a fair idea of these important concepts, I will not get into the depth and I will try and explain this topic at a very high level. So this is what we need to do. Now let's try and achieve this. We already have a network which contains web app and DB subnet. Let's see how do I create an NSG rule to restrict all the traffic from web to DB. So it says you can limit network traffic to a resource in a virtual network using an NSG. NSG contains list of security rules that either allow or deny inbound or outbound traffic. And NSG can be associated to a subnet or a network interface. I can create an NSG at the subnet level, or I can also create it at the network interface of virtual machine. Both I can do. Now, let's take the same example. Let's say I want to deny all the traffic from web to DB. Will I create NSG at the subnet level or at the virtual machine level for this? What do you think, guys? If I want to block all the traffic from web subnet to DB subnet, will I create NSG at the subnet level or virtual machine level? Any rough
Subnet
idea?
level.
Absolutely. Subnet level. Why? Because if I create it at the virtual machine level, today there are two virtual machines. I can create two rules from these two virtual machines to that one virtual machine in DB subnet. What if in future my application grows and I end up adding more web servers and more database servers? Then I will need to write the NSG rules once again for those additional instances. That is why in this scenario, I will not use NSG at the virtual machine level. I would rather keep it at the container level, folder level, or subnet level, so that I am denying blanket. I am putting a blanket deny from web to DB, which means in future, if there are 20,000 servers here in web and 10,000 servers here in DB, the rule will continue to work as it is. It will just not allow any traffic from web to DB. So when you want to create a blanket deny, always use the container level NSG, which is subnet level NSG. When you want to create a specific exclusive deny or allow, then use virtual machine level. For example, I don't want my virtual machine 1 to communicate with virtual machine 4. Then I will create NSG at the virtual machine NIC level. When I don't want virtual machine 2 to communicate with virtual machine 3, then I will create NSG at the network interface level. When it is about subnet, then I will create it at the subnet level. So my best practice says that I should create NSG rules at the subnet level to reduce the number of rules and to also reduce administrative overhead. IT is all about simplifying things, not making them complex. I just had somebody who came for verification and he asked a very simple question. If I wanted, I could have answered that question using technical jargon and he would not understood it. Since his question was very simple, I also tried to explain it in a very simple terminology and he understood it in the very first attempt, though he was a pure non-technical person. So IT is all about simplifying things. You need to understand who your audiences are. And basis on your audiences, you need to frame your answer, frame your sentences. So that's what we need to do here. So let's go ahead and understand this NSG part. So Raghuveer VNet 1 has, not this one, training VNet 1. Training VNet 1 network has 4 subnets and I want to block all the traffic from web subnet to DB subnet. So what I will do, I will create an NSG rule at the web subnet and create an outbound rule to deny all traffic to DB subnet. Right? So first I will create a network security group. So I will type network security a group in the search bar that will show me NSG service. I see some NSGs already. That was part of the POC that I did. Let's create one NSG. So we are going to create an NSG rule now. First, we will create a network security group, and then we'll create inbound and outbound rule in it. So we'll create a network security group. I'll select my, now always remember, whenever you create a resource, two things will be common. A, it will ask you to provide subscription and resource group so that it can attach that resource to a subscription for the billing purpose and put that resource into a resource group for your internal purposes, internal management purposes. So I'll select the same resource group, which is SC300 TCS, and put this name as demo NSG. Now, this is very important. The location of NSG should be the same as the location of network. Otherwise, you will not be able to associate it. It cannot happen that you create NSG in India and you are trying to use that NSG for a network which is in United States. No, it has to be in the same region, right? So when I created this region, I'm saying when I created the network, let me check once again the region of that network for which I'm doing. So training VNet 1, this is the network which contains the subnets. This network is configured in South India. So I'll create an NSG in South India. That's it. Tags, if I want, I can give. Otherwise, from the drop down, I can quickly select the tags. As I said, you can reuse them at any point in time if you have created them in the past. Then I'll hit review plus create and create this NSG. So my NSG is getting created. All right, it is created. I can navigate to NSG once again, and I see my NSG created, demo NSG. Now, when NSG is created, when you navigate to NSG, you see both inbound and outbound rule in the NSG. There are some default rules. You will find three default rules, three default inbound rules, and three default outbound rules in the NSG. Those default rules basically allow virtual machines in the network to communicate with the network, with the internet, communicate with other virtual machines, and also load balancers communicate with the virtual machines. Those are the default rules. So the first thing that I need to do, this NSG, I have just created this firewall. I have not associated it with anything. So if I want to restrict all the traffic from web to DB, I can associate this NSG to either web or to DB, any of the subnet. If I'm associating it to database, then I will create an inbound rule to deny all traffic from web subnet. If I'm associating this NSG to the web subnet, then I will create an outbound rule to deny all traffic towards database subnet. So I have a choice. Now, when it comes to best practice, always go with outbound rule so that your NSGs across the network are consistent. Instead of creating inbound deny rules, always create outbound deny rules. That's the best practice. So I will associate this NSG to my web subnet and create an outbound rule to deny all traffic towards database subnet. So how do I associate? The first thing, I will go to settings. In the settings, I see an option with the name subnets. I'll click on that option subnets. And first I'll associate this NSG to my web subnet. So I'll click on associate. When I associate, it will ask me to provide the network and subnet. So my network is already selected here. I select web subnet. There are 4 subnets. I can select web subnet and hit OK. So that way, this NSG is going to be associated with the web subnet. Now the NSG is associated with the web subnet. You can see you can associate an NSG with multiple subnets. Now I'll create an outbound security rule since it is attached to web subnet. So I hit outbound security rule and I will click on add to add a rule. This is how we create a rule. Now in the rule source, what is my source? Source is my web subnet. So how do I define web subnet here? With the IP address. So all I need is 2 pieces of information, the address space of my web subnet and address space of my DB subnet to do the blockage, to do the configuration. So I'll just duplicate this tab so that I don't have to go back and capture that information. On the other tab, I'll navigate to my network. And here I'll go to my subnets and I'll capture the information. So this is my web subnet address space. And my DB subnet. This is my DB subnet. Okay, so I've got web and DB subnet address space. So I copy the web subnet address space and navigate to my NSG. And I say my source is IP addresses. And here I will type the address space of my web subnet. So my source is web subnet. Then comes source port. There are 65,535 ports. So I will put star so that nobody in any situation is able to communicate with the other. So I will put star. Star means any port. Then destination. In the destination, once again, I will select IP address and put the IP address space of my DB subnet. I'm creating a blanket deny rule from entire subnet to entire subnet. So source is web subnet, destination is DB subnet. Then comes the port, I'm the destination port. So source port is star, destination port I will also use star here, which means no communication. Star means all. So all ports from source to all ports at destination. Protocol I will use any, and then in the action I will say deny. That's my decision making factor, allow or deny. If I say allow, then there is no point of creating this rule because by default, all the communication is allowed inside network. So I'm creating this deny rule. Then comes priority. Priority basically means if there are 2 conflicting rules which are conflicting with one another, then the rule with lowest priority will take precedence. That's the concept of priority. So I will just leave priority as it is. And in the name, I can put the name NSG to deny all outbound traffic from web to DB. If you want to put something into description, you can also put. And in the end, you will hit add. So this will create one outbound rule in your NSG service, which is associated with web subnet to deny all traffic, all outbound traffic from web to DB subnet. This is how you create NSG rules. If you wanted to create an inbound rule, then you would have associated this NSG to the DB subnet, and there you would have created an inbound rule. So let's take the example of inbound rule. Let's say I'm creating an inbound rule here. So I will click on source. I will click on add. Now, if this is inbound rule, you don't select inbound and outbound here. If I'm creating an inbound rule, I'll select inbound security rules, click add, and then I'll select source as web subnet and destination as DB subnet. So that's how I can create inbound rule also. You will see the same configurable options. You just need to make sure what you are configuring. And after you configure, you also need to test. So you can keep this NSG rules, this peering and virtual network as it is. There is no cost so far you are incurring on these services. They're all free of cost. Once we reach to the virtual machine part, then I would invite you to provision virtual machines in these subnets, in these networks, and then you can test peering part, you can test NSG part, all activities that you're doing, you can quickly test the applicability of those activities. Or if you have experience with virtual machine provisioning in Azure, be my guest, go ahead and provision the virtual machines in these subnets or in these networks and check for yourself whether with the help of peering, those two machines across network are able to communicate and those two machines across web and DP subnet are able to communicate or not when NSG is there to deny the traffic. Is everyone with me on this?
Yes.
Okay. Great. So we did NSGs. I talked about DNS part that Azure provides DNS services. So I've already talked about that part. Then gateway subnet significance I provided, virtual network peering. I've just shown you how it works. Local and global. If you are peering two virtual networks in the same region, it means local peering. If those virtual networks are across region, then it is global peering. That's the concept. And then hybrid connectivity options I also talked about, which is site to site, point to site, and express route. Okay. Create and configure virtual network in subnet. I hope all of you have done this. Create and configure virtual network peering. We have done that today. Create, configure private and public IP address. So let's see public IP address part. Private IP is already configured when you provision a virtual network. So let's understand the public IP. Now, public IPs are paid services. They are paid from day one. Private IP is free of cost. Public IP is paid because there's a cost for it. So if you want to create public IP, you can just type public IP in the search and you see public IP service. Here you see all the public IPs. This is public IP. We have one public IP associated to a VM. It's a recorded session. Okay. Then if you want to create a public IP, we just hit create. And all you need to provide is the same piece of information, your resource group, region where you want to create a public IP, wheresoever you are creating, provide that region information, name of that public IP. So let's say demo PIP. PIP stands for public IP address. Whether you need IPv4, IPv6, select the SKU of the public IP. We have two types of public IP, standard and basic. Always go with standard. We use standard for production environment because standard supports static public IP. And then we can select availability zone. Region, we can select regional or global. Regional or global basically means you can select a public IP that can be used in all the regions, or you can select a public IP that will only be used in this region. For example, East US. So we'll go with regional. That's it. IP address assignment, you can select static. You can see if I've selected standard, it is by default static. There is no dynamic address. But if I select basic, then I can select whether then it is dynamic. So in production, you will never use a dynamic public IP. You will always use a static public IP. That's it. And then you can put a DNS label. And if you want to associate this public IP with any DNS, you can put it here. And in the end, you can hit. If you want additional protection on this public IP, you can just keep disabled. Otherwise, there will be a cost for it. It has DDoS protection from virtual network. And then hit create. So this is how you create a public IP. Very simple. After you create a public IP, you can assign that public IP to a load balancer, to a virtual network gateway, to a virtual machine. Those are the devices to which public IPs can be assigned. And additional services like application gateway, data factory, and other services that needs public IP. So all you need to do is hit create and the public IP will be created. I'm not creating a public IP because it will unnecessarily cost me money and I will have to delete it. So just understand the configuration part. So you will create a public IP when you will provision virtual machines. At that point in time, you will create public IPs. So that's the concept of public IP. Configure user-defined network routes. Now, what is user-defined network routes? User-defined network routes, as I said yesterday, when you want to forward traffic from Azure to on-premises so that your firewall can filter it, you will create user-defined routes. I'll show you how it works. You also have a slide that basically talks about system routes in my presentation. You will receive this presentation today itself. I forgot to send this presentation yesterday. So here you will see the routes concept. If you want to see in the portal, it is here. You can click on routes. Route table here. And you will, so right now there is no route table because system routes are by default managed by Azure. They are not visible to end users. And any custom route that you want to create, you can create it here. So if I want to create a custom route, first I'll create a route table, a table in which I will create the route. It is like NSG. You create an NSG, then you create inbound outbound rules. Similarly, you will create a route table, then you will create a route. So this is how we create a route table. Very simple. So once the route table is created, then I can create routes. But before I create routes, I will first need to associate that route table to a subnet. Because then only the traffic from that subnet will be routed through the route table. So my route table is created. You can see it here. Under settings, I see subnet. Let's say I want all outbound traffic from database. Database is my critical server. I want all outbound traffic from database to internet filtered via firewall. So what I will do, I will create a route table, associate that route table to the database subnet. Since I've created this route table in US and my database subnet is part of a network which is in South India. That's the reason you don't see that database subnet, but just understand the concept. So let's say you will associate this route table to a subnet like this. Let's assume that default is your database subnet. After it is associated to the subnet, then you will create a route in the route table that will define the path that the traffic from that subnet will take. So let's say this is my database subnet. I will now create a route. And in the route, first I'll select a name. I'll say forward to firewall. Then I'll select the destination. In the destination, I'll type the address or service tag. If I want to type the address, I can type 0.0.0. This basically talks about /0. This basically means internet. 0.0.0/0. Or I can click on service tag and I can definitely select service tag as internet. So no service tag with the name internet is coming. So I can type IP address, which is 0.0. It means internet. Then I will select next hop. Next hop basically means that where exactly I want to send this traffic. So whenever there is a traffic which is destined towards this IP address, which is internet, where the traffic should be forwarded to. So in the next hop type, I will select virtual appliance. And here I will type the IP address of my firewall. Whatever IP address my firewall has, let's say 192.168.3.89. Whatever is the IP address, I'll type the IP address and hit enter. So what will happen from this moment onward? Any outbound traffic towards internet from database subnet will be forwarded to that next hop IP address, which happens to be my firewall. When it reaches to the firewall, it will be inspected based on the policies that you have configured at the firewall, and the firewall will decide whether to allow that traffic or deny that traffic. This is the concept of routes. Does it make sense, guys? Yes, no, maybe? Great. So that's the concept of routing. Once again, if you want to understand that in detail with practical implementation of it, just go through the recorded session of AZ104. That training was exclusively for Azure administration, and you will find the detailed information. Okay, so user-defined routes is done. DNS you have already seen. All you need to do is just select the radio button custom and provide the DNS IP address. That's it. So that's how we do the labs. So we have completed all of these labs. Next, monitor virtual network. Monitor on-premise connectivity, configure in Azure Monitor. So when it comes to virtual network monitoring, we have a service here. Inside virtual network, there is monitoring service here. You can see alerts, matrices, logs, and network flow logs. Now, flow log is very important. Flow log basically means that if I want to monitor my virtual network, I will need to monitor all the incoming traffic to my virtual network and outgoing traffic from my virtual network so that I can see who all are communicating with my virtual network and who all my virtual network are communicating with, so that I can identify if there is any illegitimate traffic, if there is any unwanted traffic. For that, we configure flow logs. So all you need to do, just hit create and you can configure the flow logs. Flow logs will be stored into a storage account. There are multiple storage options where you can store it. You can store dot flow logs into a storage account, into a log analytics workspace. There are or into a storage account you can see here, or you can store them into a log analytics workspace also. That's the concept of flow logging. So since you don't need to do anything with flow logging, that's the concept of flow logging. Okay, the other thing is monitoring. So flow logs will help you to monitor your virtual network. If you want to create some alerts, then you can also create some alerts. For example, if there is a failed ping to a VM, if somebody is trying to ping a VM, and if that request fails, you can create a monitoring alert here. So you have multiple options through which you can create the monitoring alerts. Now, when we do Entra ID, there will be a topic of monitoring Entra ID for sign-in logs, for audit logs, for failures and success. That is where I will cover matrices in detail. But right now, understand matrices are near real-time events that you can monitor. And when things do not, when there are events which are not expected, then you can have an alert configured against that matrices so that your NOC team, your SOC team, your security team is notified of those behaviors. That's what the matrices is all about. So the more time you spend with this service, there is no shortcut to practice and success. Practice you need to do yourself. Nobody can practice on your behalf. People can be successful on your behalf by taking credit of your work, but they cannot learn things on your behalf. That you need to do yourself. So please practice, practice, and practice, and come back with questions if you have any with respect to the services that I'm completing or covering in this training. So that's on the flow logging part. Okay, then comes Azure Network Watcher. Now, Network Watcher is a default service that Microsoft Azure provides. And with Network Watcher, you can basically watch your Azure network connectivity issues. Let's say you are not able to you're not able to connect to a virtual machine. When you look into the virtual machine configuration, things looks right. Then you can use Network Watcher. So you don't configure Network Watcher anymore. By default, whenever you create a network in a region, Azure creates a Network Watcher service automatically for that region that you can directly use. So if I go to Network Watcher of South India, I can see a lot of information here with this Network Watcher. Or I can create my own network. So that's what Network Watcher is. It basically helps me to monitor the network. So we will understand the monitoring part for Entra ID. That you should understand as per your project requirements, not the network monitoring, because you probably don't do that in future. Okay, then comes troubleshoot virtual network connectivity. Troubleshooting is outside of the purview of your scope. However, with the help of Network Watcher, with the help of flow logs that you have configured in the previous steps, you can definitely troubleshoot connectivity issues. I would rather cover troubleshooting Entra ID related issues in this training so that you will understand that when things do not go as expected, what you can do to fix the misconfiguration, to fix the behavior so that it is working as expected. So this is all about Azure networking that I wanted to cover. I would request you to practice in your spare time today, tomorrow, over the weekend. And whenever you have any doubt, ask it at the beginning of the session in the first 15 minutes. That is all on virtual networking from my end. If you don't have any questions, we will move on to the next topic, a topic that most of you expressed interest on, which is storage services. I'll try to cover that topic in depth so that you would have good understanding of storage. And once we reach to Microsoft Entra ID, once again, I'll pick up this topic and talk about how Entra integrates with storage, or how storage can be authenticated and authorized using Entra capabilities. So that's what we are going to cover. So is there any question on virtual networks or anything that we have done so far?
Nothing from my end.
All right, silence is half consent for me. If there are no more questions, we will now switch to storage services. Let's take a break for 5 minutes before we switch gears and talk about a topic which is totally different from networking. So we'll break for 5 minutes. At 11:30, we will start with storage services. Thank you. So when it comes to storage services in Microsoft Azure, unlike other cloud service providers, which have multiple storage services, and for each service, they have a separate view, separate dashboard. It is not in Microsoft Azure. Microsoft has storage accounts as a container service, and under storage accounts, most of these storage services are available. Now, when it comes to storage services in Microsoft Azure, you can divide them under IaaS and PaaS category. There's nothing in SaaS. Storage would always mean that data belongs to you and hardware belongs to them. So it cannot be SaaS. In SaaS, everything belongs to them. So it is under IaaS and PaaS. When it comes to IaaS, we have storage for virtual machines. And there are two types of storage that we have. One is disk that you attach to virtual machines, which is known as managed disk. And the other are files that you attach as a network drive to virtual machines and to other services. So these are the two types of storage in IaaS. A disk that we attach to a virtual machine, and it's a persistent disk. Can somebody tell me the meaning of persistent? What do we mean by persistent disk here? Siddharth, what do we mean by persistent disk? Vedant? Farhan? Sorry. Pallavi? No idea? Okay. So what do we mean by persistent disk? Persistent basically means that the disk is permanently attached to the virtual machine. Even if the virtual machine is stopped, even if the virtual machine is in shutdown mode, the storage will continue to remain attached to that virtual machine. Every time you turn your virtual machine on, you will find that disk attached to it. You will not lose the disk or the data which is kept inside. That's what persistent is. And as a file share is also persistent. Every time you navigate to the network drive, you will find the file share. So those are the IaaS services. Then comes PaaS. PaaS basically means that the service belongs to them and data belongs to you, right? And you don't build that service, it's already there. IaaS basically means you build the service like virtual machine. You provision a virtual machine, then you install application and you store data into it. So that's IaaS. PaaS, the service belongs to them and you don't provision the service. You directly use that service to store your data or host your application. So in PaaS, we have three services: blobs, tables, and queues. Blobs are further of two types: page blobs and block blobs. Page blobs basically means disk, but they are not used anymore. It's like history, past. In the past, when we were using a magnetic disk, we would use page blobs, which basically means the disk that you attach to virtual machines, they would get stored into storage account. But nowadays we use managed disk, and managed disk is outside of storage account. It has a separate view for itself. So page blobs are not being used anymore. You only have some customers from olden days who are using it. All new customers are using managed disk. Block blobs is similar to Google Drive, OneDrive, or Dropbox, any third-party cloud solution. That's block blobs. Block blobs basically means any discrete. So take the example of Google Drive. In Google Drive, you can store images, videos, audios, MP3 files, pictures, JPEG. You can store, you can create folders. You can store PDF, Word, PowerPoint, Excel. You can store any amount of data and any type of files. And they do not have to be related to one another. They can be separate also. That's what Google Drive is all about, or Block Blob is all about. Block Blob is similar to that. It is known as object storage, and object storage is defined by a storage service that provides you capability to store unrelated object data that has no relationship. And the capability depends on the service. For example, Google Drive provides you 15 GB of free space. OneDrive provides you 5 GB of free space, and you can purchase more space by paying additional money. That's block blobs. Now it says highly scalable. Why it says highly scalable? Because blobs have no limitations. You can start with 1 KB. You can keep on adding more and more data into blobs and nobody would stop you. There is no limit here. You can put terabytes of data here, highly scalable. Tiered. Tiered basically means they are available in multiple varieties. You can take hot blobs. Hot blobs basically means they are highly available. The data that you store into the blobs is highly available. Cool blobs, data is available uh, However, it is more suitable for data that we access once in 30 days. That's cool blobs. Then you have archive tier, more suitable for historical data, backup data, audit data that you don't need to access every day. You typically access that once in a while, probably once in 6 months, once in a year. That's what tiered is. REST-based cloud object storage. REST basically is an API through which you can have your applications configured to communicate with storage service in Azure and either dump data into storage service or read write data from to storage service. That's what REST based object storage. So that's blob. Then comes table. We use table in case of applications that use NoSQL data storage. Then queues, we use queues for microservices. When you are deploying microservices based applications, when you want event driven applications where you want to store events into form of queues, and then you want to execute those queues in different orders, LIFO, FIFO, you use queues. Now tables and queues have no relationship to Entra ID. Only disk files and blobs work with Entra ID or have something to do with Entra ID. So our focus is going to be on disk files and blobs as part of this session. You also see tables are used for microservices and serverless compute services, which is event-driven services. Now, other than this, you have some tools available from Microsoft that you can use to transfer a lot of data or massive storage from on-premises to cloud or cloud to on-premises. Let's say you are migrating to cloud and you have some 20 terabytes of data that you also need to migrate to cloud. So you can use Azure Import Export Service or Azure Data Box Service. With that service, you can migrate your data from on-premises to cloud. The reverse is also true. You are sick and tired of cloud. Cloud did not meet your objectives. You want to come back to on-premises. You can use the same service to transport all the data from cloud data center to your on-premises data center. Then comes another service, AZ Copy. This is for terabytes of data, large amount of data. AZ Copy is for smaller amounts of data. If you want to copy, upload some files into Azure from your local system, you can use AZ Copy. The size of that file should not go beyond 1 GB. Otherwise, it will take more time. And if it is corrupted in transit, then it will start all over again. So for smaller amount of data that you want to copy in Azure, you can use AZ Copy. AZ Copy is not used for downloading the data that you can directly download. For uploading, you use AZ Copy. Then comes Express Route. Express Route is one of the connectivity options that we discussed in the previous session, wherein if you want a dedicated tunnel from your network to Microsoft Azure and you want to copy and you want to have secure communication so that the traffic doesn't go to the internet, you can use Express Route. With the help of Express Route tunnel, you can upload or download terabytes of data, huge amount of data to Microsoft Azure or from Microsoft Azure. So these are your data transfer options in Azure. So this one slide basically gives you a high level overview of Azure Storage Services, various services which are available in Microsoft Azure. That's what this slide talks about. Any question from this slide, guys? Okay, let's move on. Now, give me a moment here. Okay, so let's move on. So this is another slide. I'm saying that was an image that comprises of information. This is just theoretical aspects that I've provided that, Azure Storage Services are divided into four main services, which is blob that I was just talking about, files, queues, and tables. And all of these four services are accessed through storage account. So you basically create a storage account in Azure, and then you can access any of these four services in the storage account. Okay. These are the features of Azure Storage Service. The features are it's durable and highly available. When I say it's durable, it basically means that what Microsoft does, when you store data into Microsoft Cloud, depending on the storage service tier that you have selected or feature that you have selected, Microsoft will create multiple copies of your data. So if any copy is left, or if your primary copy is left, Microsoft will give you access to your data from secondary copies. That's what durability is. It creates multiple copies. High availability basically means that when it creates multiple copies of your data, those copies are not kept in the same data center. They are spread across data center so that if one data center is down, you will still have access to your data from other data center. That's what high availability is. Then comes security. Yes, Azure storage is secure. Why? Because data that you store in Azure Storage or in Microsoft Cloud, it is encrypted by default. Even if you don't use your own encryption keys, Microsoft will use its own encryption keys to encrypt the data. At any point in time, they will not read your data unless there is a legal or statutory obligation. Once again, I'm repeating, cloud service providers will encrypt your data by default if you don't use your own encryption keys for the secrecy and safety of data. They will not read your data unless there is a legal obligation or statutory obligation. For example, in South India, you store some data. In South India region of Azure, you create a storage account service and you upload some data. And there is government, federal agency like Enforcement Department, Central Bureau of Investigation, local police, who has some doubts on your activities, and they approach Microsoft Azure asking to provide them access to your data. Microsoft Azure will be forced to comply and will provide access to your data to the agencies, enforcement agencies. That's the only scenario in which your data will be read by cloud service providers or will be granted access to, to enforcement agencies. Other than this scenario, there is no other scenario wherein your data will be read by cloud service providers. They absolutely have nothing to do with your data. They don't bother what kind of data you are storing, whether you're storing personal data, professional data, they don't bother about it. All they bother about is what storage options are you choosing and how much they will bill you at the end of the month and whether you're paying that bill on monthly basis or not. That's what they bother about. So yes, your data is secure. Scalable. Your storage service is scalable because it will not happen that one fine day it will say that your storage is almost 100% full. Please delete some data. No, it's highly scalable. There is no limits here. If you want to understand the limit, there is an upper limit that you can find in the subscription and limits documentation, which I was showing in the morning, which is 500 terabytes. Sorry, 500 petabytes. So 500 petabytes is the limit. So 500 petabytes is the limit which is given by Microsoft on a storage account. However, that amount of data is very humongous. You probably will not be able to reach to that limit. And if you ever reach to that limit, you will connect with Microsoft to see if there is any other option, or probably create another storage account and then put another 500 petabytes of data. That's the limit for one storage account. Managed. Storage account is a managed service for sure because the underlying infrastructure is managed by Microsoft. you will be given browser-based access to your storage service so that you can upload and download data from to your storage service or from your storage service. And you can also configure authentication and authorization and some additional configurations related to storage service based on your requirement. Accessible, yes. Storage service is a public service. It has a public endpoint, which means you can access your storage service or your data over the internet. Similar to Google Drive and OneDrive, you can access your Google Drive from your laptop, from your mobile phone, from somebody else's laptop. All you need to do is type, drive.google.com, provide your credentials, and you can access it. Same is the case with storage account. It is part of Azure portal. So you just need to authenticate yourself to Azure portal, and then you can access the storage service. Give me a Okay, so that's accessible over the internet. Other than this, if you're using a programming platform like Visual Studio, .NET, or any programming platform, you can also access your storage service through REST APIs. You have other options like PowerShell and CLI or Azure SDKs through which you can also manage your storage service. So those are the features of Azure Storage Service, which is durable and highly available, secure, scalable, managed, and accessible. Okay, disk is also a storage service. As I said, there are two types of disk. We have SSDs and we have HDDs. SSDs are solid state drives. HDDs are hard disk drives. They are magnetic and these are SSD based. They have high performance, low latency. They are cost effective and primarily meant for dev test environments, not for production because uh, their performance is very limited. It is like 500 read write request per second that they provide. So you can see here 500 IOPS, which is 500 input output per second, and 60 megabyte per second of disk. I say per second, it only supports read and write of 60 MBs of data. Hereover, it supports 250 megabytes per second of read write plus 7,500 IOPS, which means 7,500 concurrent input and output read and write request it can support. And not all virtual machines in Azure would support a premium storage. Only high-end virtual machines support it. However, standard storage is supported on all the virtual machines. I will say the lower virtual machines which comes with one CPU core, 2 GB of RAM, they also support magnetic storage. But for premium storage, you need to have a virtual machine of a minimum this size, which is DS series, GS series, LS series, or BS series. So there are different sizes. So that's the type of disk. The other thing that you need to know about storage account is from theoretical perspective. Before we get into the hands-on, I will use another presentation, which I primarily use for storage explanation. Give me a moment here. Okay, so when we provision a storage account, we basically think of these options. That what kind of storage account, what kind of service I'm going to use in storage account, which is whether I'm creating a storage account for provisioning. This is what you need to think of. When you are creating a storage account, what's your purpose? What are you going to put in the storage account? Whether you are creating it for blob, which is your object data, whether you are creating it for file, which is creating a network share, whether your purpose is queue, or table, which is NoSQL and microservices based storage, whether your purpose is to create disk or you want to create a data lake storage. So depending on what you want to, what is your intention for provisioning a storage account, that's first thing that you need to think of. Second, the decision that you need to take is performance. That what performance am I expecting from my storage account? Am I expecting high performance? Use premium. Am I expecting general performance? Then use standard tier. Then comes access tier. The third decision that you need to make, because when we provision a storage account, we will need to configure all of these settings. We will need to pick and choose options from here. So then comes access tier. Access tier basically means how often do I need quick access of files. So there are three access tier: hot, cool, archive. Hot means round the clock access, all the time. Immediate access. You want to access your data in storage, go ahead and access it. It will be quicker. No latency will be there. That's hot tier. Obviously, price will be higher. Cool tier basically means I want immediate access, but I'm not accessing the data almost every day. I'm accessing it once in 30 days, like attendance management system. When HR creates salary, they dump the data from attendance management system probably at the end of the month to calculate the salary based on the attendance of an employee, right? So a couple of applications that requires access to data once in a month, finance applications, we go with cool tier. Then comes archive. Archive means anything that I don't need to access every day, but I may need access to it. For example, historical data, audit data. Banks in India are forced to store last 10 years of transactions of each customer as per the mandate from RBI. How frequently you log into your banking website and download your account statement for the year 2015 and 2016? Probably you never did. But bank has a record of it. Last 10 years. We are in 2024 or September 2024. You can navigate to your banking website or you can visit your bank branch and ask them for your transaction of September 2014. They will provide you if your account existed at that point in time, because there's a mandate. So there are times when you don't need to access the data every day. You will require occasionally, once in a while, or probably never, but there is a compliance that will enforce you to keep that data with you, archive tier. So if you are into a business wherein you want to store some data that is probably never needed or needed once in a year, but due to compliance you need to store it, go for archive tier. It's the lowest cost tier, which means around 100 GB of data will not even cost you $10-15 a month. That's the tier. You want to see the price, you can check that in Azure pricing calculator. Then next is replication. This is the durability part, durability and availability part. Now, when you store data in Azure, you also need to select replication, that how many copies of my data will be created and where exactly they will be stored. That's what replication is. There are multiple options. LRS stands for locally replicated storage. I will explain that from here. So you understand this point from here. LRS stands for locally replicated storage. It basically means that when you select LRS as replication, Azure will create 3 copies of your data. 3 copies. If you store one file, 3 copies will be created. Where exactly Azure is storing those 3 copies? In the same region where your data resides, in the same data center. That's what locally redundant replication is. Now in locally redundant, there are 2 options. One is locally redundant and the other is zone redundant. Locally redundant basically means all the 3 copies of your data will be stored in the same region where your data resides. If you choose zone redundant, then those 3 copies will still be stored in the same region, however, across data centers in the availability zone. That's the concept of locally redundant or zone redundant, 3 copies and 11 times 9 of durability. That's locally redundant. Next is geo-redundant. Geo-redundant is the next level wherein you will pay some additional money. Geo-redundant basically means there will be 6 copies of data. You can see there are 6 copies, 3 primary copies and 3 secondary copies. The first 3 copies are locally redundant, will be in the same data center where your data is stored. But the additional 3 copies will be kept in a different region. You can see secondary region. So it says replicate to a secondary region in case of primary regional disaster. The secondary region is determined based on a primary pair region. So if I'm creating, let's say if I store some data into central India, which is Pune, and if I select geo-redundant storage for my storage account, then Azure will create 3 additional copies of my data and store it into South India, which is Chennai. So I will have 3 copies in Pune and 3 copies in Chennai. That's geo-redundant storage. Now, if Pune goes down, I will still have my data stored in Chennai. However, I will not have access to that data. That is just stored so that whenever Pune comes back on, the data from Chennai will be restored to Pune and customer will be granted access. That's what GRS is. 6 copies, 3 in the same region, 3 across region. Now the question is, if I don't have access to data, if I don't have access to those 3 additional copies in Chennai, what is the point of doing it? Customers ask this question. So for that, Microsoft has another arrangement, which is read access geo-redundant storage. It basically means that those 3 additional copies that you have in Chennai, when Pune is down, you will get read-only access to those copies so that your business doesn't suffer. You will still have data. However, you will not be allowed to make any write to those copies. You will not be able to edit any data, write more data into Chennai. Why? Because your core storage service is configured in Pune. So you will need to wait till Pune comes back on so that you can restore your connectivity to your account and you can start writing information. But reading will be allowed, which is read access. So it says data is replicated synchronously to primary region. Your data will be in sync with your primary region and you will have read access. That's RAGRS, read access geo-redundant service. So if there is any customer who asks me, what should I choose? I either say go for LRS or RAGRS. There is no point of going with GRS because you will pay for a service that you will not be able to leverage or consume because they will not allow you access. That is only there to ensure that you will not lose your data. Imagine Pune data center or all the data centers in Pune, they catches fire and they are reduced to ashes. GRS is there. 3 additional copies are in Chennai. Microsoft will rebuild Pune data center once again and then restore the data from Chennai to Pune and provide you access to your data. That's GRS. Same example, Pune data center catches fire. It is reduced to ashes. Microsoft will take 10 days to rebuild Pune. For those 10 days, you can access your data in Chennai if you have RAGRS. Plus, you will not be able to write anything. You can only read it. Write won't be possible. If you want to write data, then you can probably create another storage account in Chennai. There you can do the upload also. So that's the concept of replication in Azure, which is 6 options, which is RAGRS, LRS, GRS, and ZRS, ZRS, and RAZGRS. Wherever it says Z, Z basically means zone. Zone basically means multiple data centers coupled into one cluster. That's what zone is all about. So that's the concept of replication in Azure. Okay, so that's replication. Then comes deployment model. So you will also choose deployment model. Right now, the default deployment model for all new customers is resource manager. If you are an old customer of Azure, like you are with Azure for 2010, in 2014, they introduced Azure Service Management or new Azure portal 10 years ago. If you are a customer from 2011, 2010, 2013, or till 2014, then you will have access to classic model. Otherwise, you will not see this option. For example, we are a customer of Azure from yesterday. We only created an account yesterday. So we will not have an option to choose the deployment model. By default, our deployment model will be a resource manager based deployment model. It is nothing but a backend arrangement that allows us to provision these services. So that's the configuration that you need to pick and choose while you build a storage account in Microsoft Azure. I'm open to questions if you have any before we get into the provisioning part. That's all theory that you need to know from storage account perspective. Yes, guys. Any question on the theoretical aspects? All right. If there are no more questions, let's move on. So let's go ahead and provision storage accounts. Let me see if there is anything that I want to talk about before we get into the provisioning part. I've already talked about SSDs and SDDs. I will share this presentation so you can go through the additional slides. Replication I've already explained. Block I already talked about. AZ copy, these are some options. Use cases for Azure files, which is network storage. And let's talk about it. So if you want to, so as I said, there are four types of storage: blobs, files, tables, and queues. Tables and queues out of scope. Blob and files. Blob means object storage and managed disk. File means network storage, file share. You have some network drives in your environment that you can access by typing // and the drive name or drive IP, and then you see the network drive or file share. Or you already have a network drive mapped on your laptop, which is not a local disk, but is a network disk, which is mapped on other employees' laptop also. It contains some common data. It contains some common data and some specific data also, like multiple folders. Some folders you have access to, some folders you don't manage access. It says access denied because there are NTFS permissions. So you can use Azure Files when you want to create a shared folder, when you want to move from traditional file share file servers to cloud-based file share service, you can use Azure Files. So if you don't want to use network attached storage like on-premises file servers, you can use Azure Files. You can simplify cloud development. In fact, you can use Azure Files to. Okay, so Romil is moving. That's okay, Romil. Please make sure that you go through the, go through the session recording as well as the hands-on labs that we are doing. You will do that hands-on lab in your spare time today itself. Okay. We can use for containerization. So these are some of the use cases for file share. We can use them for backup, soft delete, and other options. These are about file share. Then there is a tool with the name Azure Storage Explorer. It's a UI-based tool. It's a small UI-based tool. We can also use this tool to to basically provision storage accounts, to manage storage accounts, and to do some some use cases. I'll talk about it probably tomorrow in the first half. This all I talked about. Okay, so that's about the theoretical aspects of storage account. Let's get into the provisioning of storage account and let's understand a couple of things ourselves. Okay. So all of you, please navigate to Microsoft Azure portal. And in the Azure portal, in the search, please type storage accounts. That will take you to storage account dashboard. You will see all the storage accounts listed here. Since we have started using this subscription yesterday itself, we have not created any storage account yet. So there is nothing which is shown here. You can also see you can create a storage account to store up to 500 terabytes of data in the cloud. If you need more, create another storage account and store another 500 terabytes. It's a petabyte scale storage service in Azure. So let's create a storage account. So we will hit create. I will explain all the options. Now, if you notice, we have more tags. We have more tabs here. In the networking, when we created networking service, we had a total of 2 tags. I'm saying 3 tags are common, which is basics tags and review plus create. Now here you have additional 4 tabs. So you will need to fill in information in all the tabs based on your business requirements. Let me know when everyone is on this page. Okay, so let's start filling the information. Guys, I would really appreciate if you speak. Otherwise, I would think as if I'm talking to myself. And in that situation, I would rather be a computer, a robot who will just keep talking and then just finish the session. So let's keep it interactive. Let's ask questions. It cannot happen that you don't have any questions, or it cannot happen that you are only interested in Entra and you will only start to speak when we start with Entra next week. Either you are talking from day one or you're not talking. Okay. Create a storage account. So on the basics tab, let's start with the same concept. The first thing that we need to provide is subscription, by default selected. Next is resource group. I'll keep all my resources that I create as part of this training in the same resource group so that at the end of the training, I can delete them all in one go. Or I can keep a track of my cost. And whenever I find a resource costing me much, I can quickly go to my resource group, navigate to that resource, make the configuration changes if required to reduce the cost or delete it. Storage account name. Storage account name, since it has a public endpoint, it is accessible over the internet. It has to be unique. 2 customers of Azure cannot have the same storage account. It has to be unique. 2 storage account cannot have the same name because it's over the internet. Other than this, you cannot use while putting storage account name, you cannot use uppercase. It has to be in lowercase. It cannot start with a number. It has to start with a letter. It cannot be of unlimited characters. It has to be between 3 and 24 characters. This is the limit. It can only contain lowercase letters and numbers. It should not have any special character. And it should be between 3 and 24 characters. If you put any name that is already taken, for example, I'm typing testing. See, it will say that this name is already taken. Somebody, I don't know who, in Microsoft Azure is using this name already for their storage account. I cannot choose this. If I say testing storage, this name is also taken. Somebody is already using it. So my name has to be unique. So in order to make it unique, I will probably add some numbers to it. And this is available. Testing storage 2024 is available. Don't type this name. Otherwise, we all will get an error. Only one person will be able to provision. Rest 14 people will get an error that the name is already taken. So put a name of your choice. Do not put this name. Then region, you can choose a region which is same concept. Primary service, this. Now, what is your purpose of storage account? As I said from the presentation, that when you provision a storage account, you need to select the purpose. What is your purpose? Are you creating a storage account for keeping file shares? Select files. Are you creating a storage account for table and queues? Select other. Are you creating a storage account for disk or for general purpose, which includes all the services? Select the first option. When you select the first option, it will contain files, tables, and queues, all the services. But if you just select the second option, then your storage account would only contain file service, no other capabilities. If you select other, it would only contain table and queues. So select the first option and it will contain all the capabilities. So you've selected Azure Blob Storage. Now you will need to select your primary workload. What exactly are you want to store? So these are your options. You can see big data, backup and archive, cloud native, high performance, machine learning, others. Now these are some new capabilities that they have recently added in the UI. They were not available in the past. So what I will select, backup and archive, because that's what my use case for storage. I want to use this storage for backup and archive for storing data, or I can select other. And when I select other, then I will get all the options. So that's what I will select. Then comes performance, whether standard or premium. For this demo perspective, let us all select standard. There is no point of selecting premium because the only difference it would make is that the storage account will be configured on a premium hardware with SSDs. And if you select standard, it will be configured on a hardware which has magnetic disk. So we don't bother what happens in the backend because it's a non-production environment. It's a demo environment. So we'll go with standard. Then comes redundancy. You have already understood the concept of redundancy, which is LRS, GRS. So to optimize the cost, let's keep LRS. So these are my options that I've selected on the basics tab. Is everyone with me here?
Yes.
Great.
Yes,
Next.
Yes.
Now, storage is a security service also. Why? Because any service where you are storing your data is mission critical to your business. Your data could be important, mission critical also. So storage account service gives you a couple of security configurations also. And some configurations are by default selected. Some you can choose based on your business requirements. While we create the storage account, right from beginning to end, I will talk about each and every configuration which is available. Whether we select it or not is a different thing. So let's start with the advanced tab. The first option, requires secure transfer for REST API operations. This basically means that I'm creating the storage account and I will be using REST APIs to call the storage account to probably read data from it or write data to it. If you don't have that requirement, if you're not using any application to be configured to access the storage account using APIs, then you can uncheck this box. Or you can keep it checked because that's the default configuration. Then allow enabling anonymous access on individual containers. Now this is by default unchecked. This basically means that if I enable this, then anybody can access my storage account content. By default, my storage account and data that I store in my storage account is private to my network. It is only accessible from Azure portal. And only people who have access to Azure portal and RBAC granted to them for storage account can access that data. The moment I check this box, I am actually creating a configuration that would allow anyone from anywhere in the world to access my data. Definitely, I will need to provide them URL. This is the same configuration which I have done. When I shared session recording with you, I created a public URL, shared that URL with you, and put a password restriction on it. So whosoever has that URL and password can access the session recording from anywhere in this world. That is the same configuration here. That is why this configuration is by default unchecked, because it's a use case specific configuration. Unless you are creating a storage account for storing some general documents which should be accessible to everyone, like policies, procedures, catalogs, or drivers, anything that is accessible to general public at large, you can create that storage account for and check this box. So we will not check it. Next, default to Microsoft Entra authorization in Azure portal. This portion we'll cover when we talk about Entra part. So we'll come back to storage account when we are in Entra. Next, minimum TLS version. Right now, just keep it unchecked. TLS stands for transport layer security, which basically means encryption in transit. There are three types of encryption: encryption at rest, encryption in transit, encryption at use or in use. When you copy data from source to destination, while that data is moving from source to destination, it must remain encrypted in transit also, so that if there is a hacker who intercepts that data, that hacker is not able to access the data or read the data because of encryption. So Microsoft Azure uses multiple encryption methods. 1.3 is the latest method, which is not yet available in Azure. So we can choose 1.2, and by default 1.2 is chosen. There are some legacy applications which doesn't support 1.2. So if your intention is to use storage account for an application which is legacy, you can come back to this window and support a TLS version that's application supports. Next, permitted scope for copy operation. Copy operation basically means this storage account that you are creating, can data from this storage account be copied to other storage accounts? Right now it says from any storage account, which means you can copy data from any storage account to this storage account. This is in preview, that's why it says from any. If I'm creating this storage account from production perspective, I will never go with this option. I would probably go with this option, which is I would only allow copy of data from storage accounts which are in the same tenant, because same tenant means my organization only. Or I can go more restrictive by selecting this option, which is only from those storage accounts that has a virtual endpoint to the same virtual network, which means only those storage accounts which are part of a specific virtual network, they can copy data from the storage account. So these are my options. So I go with the default right now. Then namespace. Namespace is basically used for data lake, which is another storage service. Leave that part, that's outside of the scope of this training. Access control. Now, we can also use storage account to host a static website. In that case, you will need to upload your website code. For that, we can use SFTP solution or Azure Storage Explorer. So if you have that intention, you can check it. But before you check these options, you will need to check this option first. Then you can only exercise these options because they are for data lake. So we'll keep them unchecked. Then comes blob storage. Allow cross-tenant replication. Cross-tenant replication basically means, since over here we are, imagine that over here we have selected this option that I only allow copy to the same storage accounts to the other storage account in the same tenant, which means what if in future I want to copy some data from this storage account to other storage account which is part of ABC Corp, the company that I acquired? Then because of this setting, I will not be able to do that. So I will enable this setting, enable this checkbox. Now I will be able to replicate data from this storage account to other storage accounts in other tenants also. That's the concept of this checkbox. So I'll just uncheck it because I don't have any other tenant. And I'll go back and keep the same setting. Next, access tier. There are two tiers. Hot is default tier. By default, the radio button is checked for hot, which says optimized for frequently accessing data and everyday usage scenario. However, if you feel that you don't access data every day, once in 30 days, you can choose cool tier and your cost will be less of storing data. So we'll go with the default option. Azure file, you can enable Azure file share, but since we have not selected the option for Azure files, that's why this option is by default faded. But if you notice, it is checked, which means if I use the storage account for Azure file share creation, I will be able to use large file share, which provides me storage up to 500 terabyte. So this is my second tab, advanced tab. Any question on this tab, guys? Okay, next, networking tab. Networking tab basically means who will have access to this storage account, whether you want the storage account to be accessible over the internet or you want to restrict access of this storage account to your network that you created in the morning, your virtual network. So by default, the default configuration is enable public access from all networks. So by default, my storage account is accessible from anywhere in the world, like Google Drive, OneDrive. However, if I want it to restrict, if I want access of my storage account to be restricted to my network only, because it only contains internal data, business data, which is not meant for outsiders, for my customers, then I can select the second radio button. And when I select the second radio button, it says enable public access from selected virtual networks and IP address. Now it will give me additional configuration where I can select my virtual network. So I can select a virtual network. Now this storage account will be accessible from that virtual network only, which means you can only access the storage account from a machine which is part of this virtual network. And you can also define subnets. Since in that virtual network only one subnet it is selected. So this is restricting access of your storage account to a specific virtual network and IP address. You can also define IP address here. By default, your IP will be included because you are doing this configuration. You can add additional IP addresses also. So if you don't want your storage account to be accessible outside of your corporate network, it should only be accessible in Pune. Then you can put the public IP of your Pune office, and then it will only be accessible in Pune. That's the restriction part. Next, disable public access and use private access. Now, what is this disable public access and use private access? It basically means that I will create a private endpoint for my storage account that will give me a private IP of my storage account. And I will use that private IP to access the storage account. In the second option, I will have my storage account restricted to a certain virtual network or IP address, but even though those virtual networks and IP address will use the same URL, the public URL to access it. In the third option, the public URL will be disabled completely. Your storage account will be hosted inside your network inside a subnet. It will acquire a private IP and then you can use that private IP to access your storage account. That is what third option is all about. So second and third option is almost similar with the minor difference of in this third option, the public URL is disabled and you can use your storage account using a private IP address or your custom URL. You can create a CNAME record for it and you can use it accordingly. That's the three options with respect to the networking. So these are the three options. Next, we'll go with the default once again. Next is routing. When you are accessing your storage account, when you are copying data from source to destination based on the previous settings, what routing should use? There are two options, internet routing or Microsoft routing. I would always go with Microsoft routing because in this situation, my data will always travel within Microsoft network backbone. It will never go to internet. And if you want to understand Microsoft network backbone, I have shown you that day that Microsoft has a great network backbone now, wherein all networks are connected to almost all the regions. So I'll show you this part. So this is the global infrastructure. Now you see these lines that are moving from here and there, these thin lines, these are network these are network cables or network connectivity. So if you select Microsoft routing, and let's say you're copying some data from Australia east to West US, from here to here, then the data will follow these lines, this network, Microsoft network backbone, which is the shortest. Whatever is the shortest, it will follow, which is like this. From Australia, it will go all the way to here, to this region, which is Malaysia, East Asia. From East Asia, it will either take sea route, optical fiber cables, undersea water cables, or it will go to India, and then from India, it will take this route. Basically, routing will be decided by Microsoft here in this case, when it reaches from source to destination. If you select the second option, which is internet routing, then the path that it will take will be decided by the routers over the internet. If you had seen the video how internet works that I shared yesterday, you would understand that internet is a collection of thousands of routers who decide the best shortest path for a traffic to reach its destination. That's what internet routing is. So in production environment, we always go with Microsoft routing so that my data remains within Microsoft network backbone, which is more secure than internet. So these are my networking options. Is everyone with me on this? Any questions so far?
No, Raghav.
Great. Next is data protection. Now we have decided who will have access. We have decided whether the copy operations will be permitted. We have also decided that whether the access will be limited to everyone or to my network, or it will be a private access. We have taken that decision. And when data is copying from one location to another, whether it will use internet routing or Microsoft routing. Next option is data protection, which basically means that what am I doing to protect my data? I've discussed from the network perspective, from the access perspective. Now in this step, I'll talk about data. So the first thing is soft delete. Soft delete basically means recycle bin. When you delete something from your laptop, accidentally or intentionally, it goes to recycle bin. It stays there for 30 days and then it is permanently deleted. You can also do shift delete to permanently delete it. That's your choice. I don't do shift delete ever. I always delete so that it goes to recycle bin. And when I gain senses, I realize that, oh, that was a mistake. I can quickly recover it. Same concept here. You can protect your data from accidental or erroneous deletion or modification by enabling the soft delete. Soft delete basically means that once the data is deleted, it will be retained for 7 days, which is the default configuration from blobs, from containers, from file share, different storage services. And at any point in time, in 7 days, you can go back to the view where it says deleted data or recycle bin, and you can restore it. This is 7 days. Now, till 7 days, it is included in the service cost. The moment you keep it 8 days, or the moment you keep it 365 days, you will pay an additional charge. There will be an additional cost for it. 7 days is by default included. So I will go with 7 days unless my management approves for an additional cost of storage, because it will charge you for storage cost, retention cost. So this is my soft delete part, which is very important for production data. Next is tracking. Tracking basically means that when I am uploading data into my storage account, I want to track changes. If somebody is changing my data, there is a Word file in my storage account. Somebody opens that Word file and makes some modification to it. I want those changes to be tracked. For that, I can enable this blob change feed checkbox. It will track all the changes. If I want to create multiple versions of my document, let's say I upload a file with the name abc.txt today. Then I upload the same file tomorrow. by design, the previous file will be replaced with the new file. That's exactly what happens in computing systems. But in versioning case, it will not delete the previous file. It will not replace the previous file with the new file. It would rather create multiple versions of that file. So it would say version 1, version 2, version 3, version 4, version 5, and it will keep creating versions so that at any point in time, you can go to that file and see how many versions of this files are there or how many times this files was uploaded with some or no changes to it. That's what versioning is. So you can enable these settings. Now, definitely these settings will have cost implications. If there is a file of 100 MB, and if you enable versioning for it, and if that file is uploaded 20 times, then the total space that it will occupy is 2000 MB, which is equivalent to 2 GB. So you will pay for the price of 2 GB of storage. So when you exercise any of these options, please make sure to understand the cost implications of it also. Security is a good thing. I'm saying I would really love to have, advanced CCTV cameras deployed, at my home, which has the capability to, record the voice. And I can even talk to them, in real time. I can give them instructions to do a lot of things like IoT devices. But there is a cost also that I need to pay. What if I only have 2000 rupees in my pocket? With 2000 rupees, I can only purchase a MI or CP plus camera with basic configuration. So depending on what your pocket allows, plus what your security requirements are, create a combination. Strike a balance between cost and security. Try to create a trade-off and then go for the configurations. I've seen customers not understanding these concepts and ending up selecting all the checkboxes thinking that my storage account is secure. And when they receive the bill, then they get surprised. How come I'm getting so much of bill for the storage account? While on the pricing calculator, it only shows for 100 GB of data, I will pay $2. Now I've got a bill of $200. Where is the difference? Difference lies in these configurations. Okay, access control. Access control basically means that I can put some time-based retention policy that will help retain my documents and it will not be able to delete. Nobody will be able to modify or delete my documents. That is known as immutability support. So these are the options from protection perspective. Then the next, which is again encryption. Encryption is also protection. Now, Microsoft has intentionally created a separate tab instead of integrating this encryption capability in data protection tab at the bottom. There's a separate tab. Now you can see encryption type. You've not selected anything, then by default, it's Microsoft managed keys. So Microsoft is by default encrypting all the data that you store in Microsoft Data Center in your storage account service using its own encryption keys. It doesn't mean it is their keys, they will access your data. I've already told you in what scenario they will access the data. Rest, they will never access it. However, if you want to use your own encryption keys because you want to kill that 1% of the possibility where Microsoft will grant access to your data to enforcement agencies, you will use your own encryption keys. Now, if enforcement agencies or if Microsoft has wasted interest and they wanted to access your data, they will not be able to do so because they will not have decryption key available. So they can't decrypt the data. Most recently, I'm saying whether you noticed or not, there is a new cloud service provider that has come into existence from Ola. Ola is a company which is into, which is into automobile sector, which is aggregated cab, and then they're also building electric vehicles now, scooties and cars. So Ola has also created their own cloud with the name Kritim. Kritim is a Sanskrit word which basically means artificial. So they've created their own cloud, and they have migrated all their applications from Microsoft Azure to their own cloud. They migrated everything to their own cloud, and now they are using their own cloud to run their business. They even created their own Google Maps. I'm saying own maps. So they stopped using Google Maps, which almost led them a saving of 100 crore rupees a year. They created their own maps. It's a different thing that they've been accused by MapMy India to copy their code and whatnot. The point that I'm trying to make here is the same concept. Why did Ola or why did the owner decide to migrate from Azure to their own cloud? There was a security incident. He accused Microsoft of reading the data, the mission critical data that he was storing in Microsoft Azure cloud. The data related to some source code, some formula that he was using for managing his business, probably cab aggregation business, or probably putting together the concept or architecture of the car that he's going to build at par with Tesla very soon in India. That was the issue. This is internal, not available on public domain. This conflict or this suspicion or this this basically led him to decide to move everything from Microsoft Azure to his own cloud platform. And what was shown in the news is that Microsoft deleted his post from LinkedIn, and he felt irate, he felt bad about it, and that's where he decided to move everything from Microsoft to his own cloud. And probably he's working towards creating his own LinkedIn. He's another Elon Musk who thinks differently, who has an appetite to take risk. And I appreciate for a couple of qualities of him that I basically see in him in terms of coming up with innovation, doing things. Definitely, there are quality issues, there are customer service issues, but those are secondary things. First, you build a technology, you build a concept, and then you probably improve on it. No company has ever been able to provide good customer service while they were experimenting with product. It's the same story everywhere in the world. So people accuse him of bad services, bad customer retention part. It's all accepted as long as you're building a solution. You are being creative and building something that will take your country to the global platform. Anyways, that's my personal opinion. But the point is this encryption part, that encryption is very important. You must encrypt your data, convert a plain text into cipher so that nobody can access it. And even if they have access to that data, they can't figure out what is there. So if you feel that your data is mission critical to your business, you don't want anyone to read it, go with customer managed keys. Microsoft provides you a service in the name Azure Key Vault that you can use to generate encryption keys and use those keys to encrypt the data. Or you can use third-party HSM solutions, which are hardware security modules. They are physical hardware which can generate encryption keys. They are the safest encryption method, which is FIPS-140 certified, which is a standard for encryption. You can also use them, but they are damn expensive. So this is on the encryption. We'll just go with the default option. That's it. Next is tag. You already know what the concept of tag is. So I can select tags from previous resources because I use these two common tags, which is owner and purpose. This is all about Azure Storage Account. Two things that I'm leaving at this point in the Azure Storage Account configuration. One is Entra ID, the other is Key Vault. Key Vault and Entra ID I will do together when we reach to Entra ID part because we have those topics covered at that point in time. That's it. In the end, you hit create. It will validate all the configuration that you have provided. And once that validation is complete, you will have create button highlighted that you can hit to provision a storage account in Microsoft Azure. So all of you, if you were following me throughout, please go ahead and hit create and let this storage account get created. Once it gets created, I will teach you, I will share how do we upload data into storage account because that's the end goal of doing this exercise. If you don't store anything in the storage account, it is of no use.
All right, the storage account is provisioned. So we can navigate to our storage account. And this is how storage account dashboard looks like. All the configurations that you have provided, you will see them here. Your resource group name, your location, subscription ID, disk date, all these information. And then the most important part is data storage. So when you click on data storage, you will see all 4 options. Why? Because we selected other. We did not tell Microsoft. So Microsoft has given us all the 4 capabilities. Containers. Containers means blob, whether it's object storage or page storage. File share, queues and tables. Queues and tables we'll not focus on. Containers and file share we'll continue to work with. So let's start with containers. Before I get into that, is everyone done with provisioning storage account?
Yes,
Okay,
I'm done.
let's understand the containers part. So when I click on containers, container is nothing but a folder in which you store your data. It's like a bucket in AWS or cloud storage, Google Cloud Storage bucket in GCP. By default, a container is created with the name logs. This is default. You all will see it today itself. You can see September 11th, 12:46 p.m. IST. This comes from your system time. In this container, the activities that you will do in this storage account, when you upload data, when you download data, when you make some configuration changes, any activity that you are doing, that activity is getting stored into this folder, logs container. If you want to upload some data into storage account, and if you want to store data, your own data, business data, for that you need to create a separate container. So you will click on plus container. I'm saying add container here, provide the container name. Now the container name can also not be in caps lock, in uppercase. It should be in lowercase. See, if I try to put an uppercase, it will give me an error. It says no, no uppercase, lowercase only. So I'll put a container. I'll say Raghu demo contain. Now container name can be common. I'm saying it could be the same for 2 customers because it's under inside the storage account. It doesn't have its own identification. So I provide a container, and remember this setting, anonymous access, that we did not check that box. That is why it says private. So my storage account is private as we speak, and anything that I store is only accessible from Azure portal and only accessible to those who have reader level access to storage account. So I create this container. Now the container is created, which is Raghuvi demo. In this container, I can upload data. I can upload data from my local system. That's the purpose I created the storage account for storing data. Now, do not try to upload data from your corporate laptop because your corporate laptop may have an EDR solution on it with DLP configured. The moment you try to upload some data from your corporate laptop to the storage account, this will be considered a security threat, security incident by the DLP solution because it would think that you are copying your official data to your personal storage account, to a cloud storage, right? If you want to copy something, create a Word document, create a new file yourself on desktop, put the file name as storage account demo. Do not type anything in that file name. Do not store any data in it. Just a blank file you can try and copy. Because in that case, even if it generates a security incident, that file will be added to that security incident. And when you receive a call from security team asking for justification, you can tell them that I did that for the purpose of understanding storage account service. And you guys can check there was nothing in the file. It was all blank. It was not any customer data that I copied to cloud storage. So that way you can defend yourself. So I give you this choice whether you want to try it or not, but I'll show you from my system how to do it. If you have a personal laptop, go ahead and do it. There is no worry. So you can click on upload here. When you click on upload, it gives you an option that says browse for files, right? You can see browse for files. You can click on browse for files here. It says browse for files and it opens your local system. And from local system, you can upload any file, any data into storage account. So what I will do to show you a real-time implementation of storage, I will upload the presentation which I'm using in this training. And I'll share that presentation through storage account. Give me a moment. Okay, so I'll hit upload once again. I'll navigate to the place where that presentation is. Okay, for example, I'm sharing it in the PDF format because in PPT format, the size is too large. So I have selected that presentation. I will hit upload. Now it is uploading that presentation in the PDF format in the storage account here. So it is uploaded. It is related to Azure AD, but that's okay. We can use this one also. So I've uploaded this presentation here. That's how you upload data. Now you can upload terabytes of data, petabytes of data into storage account using the same option. You can also use AZ copy to upload the data. You can also use Azure Storage Explorer to upload the data. You can also use REST APIs to upload the data. You can use CLI, PowerShell, and NSGs also to upload the data. There are multiple options. Now, how do I grant access to you to this data, to this file, right? So what I will do, I will click on this data and I will copy the URL of this data. This is the URL of this file. As I told you that storage is a public service. So any object that you upload in the storage is public. I'm saying it has a public endpoint, public URL, unless you restrict access of your storage to your network, which we have not done. So I'll copy it and I'll share it with you. I'll put it into the chat and tell me whether you are able to access or not. You need to copy the entire, don't click on the link, just copy the entire link and put it into the browser and you should be able to access it. Can you check quickly, guys, if you're able to access or not?
Getting public access not permitted in trying to copy and paste the entire file.
Okay.
Others
So when
are
you,
getting
so I'll do that also. I'll copy it to clipboard like this. I'll go incognito and I put that here and try to access it. See what it says. Public access is not permitted on this storage account. And this is expected because if you look at the configuration carefully of the storage account, it doesn't allow public access, right? I'm saying if you click on this, if you click on the container, because we have not enabled public access for the container. So if I still want you to be able to access this file, I will need to change the configuration of the storage account, right? So what I need to do, I will navigate to container. This is the container. And inside this container, I want to change the access level. So when I click on change access level, right now it is faded. It is faded because when I provisioned the storage account, I did not check the box that allows anonymous access. That is why I can't change this option. So what I will do, if I still want you to access this document, I will navigate to my storage account. Under settings, under configuration, under settings, I see configuration option. I'll click on configuration and I'll check this box now, which is allow blob anonymous access. This is the setting that I did not check. That's why it shows disabled. I will click on enable. I'll enable this setting and save it. Now, since I enable this setting, I'm making sure that my storage account and its documents, its objects are accessible. So after I enable this setting, I'll come back to my container. And now, even that setting is enabled, I will not be able to access it because that setting has just mandated that documents are accessible. You can see the data is still not accessible. Why? Because you have dual layer of security. One is at the storage account, other is at the container. Now I'll go to my container, and in my container, I will change the access level. This time, this option is available. Now I'll make it container, anonymous access, anonymous read access for containers in Blob. After I check this box, now it is anonymous access. Now I'll go back to that URL wheresoever I have opened it and refresh it. I should be able to access the file. I'm saying anybody should be able to access the file who has the URL. See, the file is accessible. That's the concept of security. Make sense?
Yes.
And if I change it back to private, you will not be able to access it anymore. I've changed it back to private. So this is how we can use Azure Storage Account to store data for my business. And based on my access requirements, I can configure access for my storage account within the limits of my corporate network or to the public at large, which includes my customers and stakeholders, depending on what I want to share. So let's say you are in the manufacturing industry, you manufacture laptops and desktops, and there are drivers for it, and you want to share drivers with the users, similar to Dell. So you can create a storage account, you can upload all the drivers on that storage account, and you can share the URL with your customers and say, if you ever need to download drivers for your laptop, please browse this URL. Or you can embed that URL into your website. So customer will navigate to drivers and it will automatically be able to see the content of your storage account. Customer can pick and choose the driver and download it because you have enabled anonymous access on that storage account container. So that's the use case for storage account. So we'll continue with more use cases of storage account tomorrow, as you wanted me to kind of focus on storage account. Most of the participants shared that they wanted to understand this concept. So we'll do more on storage account tomorrow. But what